Election news that matters to you. Go to abc.net.au/Australia Votes or download the ABC News app.
Everybody say babies!
Babies! A new season brings new joy.
Congratulations.
And new romance.
What's all this?
The evidence suggests you've got an admirer.
But it's not all celebration.
Nonata's house is going private.
We have to find another way ahead, or Nonata's house will not be serving anyone.
And faith will be tested.
It is not my body that has failed.
Call the Midwife. Saturday on ABC TV and ABC iView. Building a home causes a range of emotions.
What's mad? Wow.
Some visions are meticulously planned.
Every inch so well crafted.
This is exactly what I hoped it would be.
That is magic. I mean, proper magic.
Others just go with the flow.
Drunken eBay purchase. It's going to be really urban meets rural.
How are you going to do it?
Not sure yet.
All new grand designs. Next Sunday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Tonight, the major parties spend time in the top end, but the campaign is dominated by security questions abroad. A Ukrainian mother and child killed in a Russian attack on the once safe city of Odessa. France votes. Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen cast their ballots as the country has its say. And tonight's special report, the volunteers working to give returned World War I soldiers the posthumous recognition they deserve. Good evening and a warm welcome to ABC News. I'm Mariam Saab. The Prime Minister has issued a warning to the Solomon Islands, declaring that he won't allow China to set up a permanent military base on Australia's doorstep. Scott Morrison is continuing to face questions on the campaign trail, with Labor blaming him for the controversial Security Pact. Here's political reporter Jane Norman.
Welcome. Hello, Penny. I'm Meredith, the town crier of Alice Springs.
Wow. A campaign clash in the Red Centre. After refusing to front the media yesterday, today the Prime Minister returned to his campaign theme, the economy, with a $300 million investment in gas and clean energy projects in the Territory.
There are some loud voices out there today, but there are many, many quiet voices all around this country which want to ensure that we have a strong economy.
But yet again, a controversial Liberal candidate is proving a distraction.
I have received death threats. My family are away out of Sydney because I don't want them to witness what I am going through.
Catherine Deeve's record of transphobic and offensive remarks has made her a target, but she found an ally on the campaign trail.
Being pro-women is not anti-trans as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks very much.
On the eve of Anzac Day, Labor pledged a $500 million boost to support for veterans.
To repair a decade of damage.
Their leaders still in isolation, Labor's Mark Butler and Penny Wong took centre stage on day 14, keeping up the pressure on the coalition for failing to stop a security pact that could see China gain a foothold in Australia's backyard.
That has demonstrably made Australia, the region, less secure and Australians less secure.
Labor argues a decade of cuts to foreign aid spending has undermined Australia's authority and influence.
You will see more resources and more energy from a Labor government in the Pacific.
Australia's still the biggest donor in the Pacific, with $1.7 billion set aside for the region. Solomon Islands receives about $170 million of that, but the figure has fallen dramatically since the end of Ramsay, Australia's multi-year assistance mission, putting the country behind Papua New Guinea and Fiji.
The Australian government's support for the Solomons has been very effective. All I can tell you is the Chinese government does not play by the same rules.
The Prime Minister confirming he hasn't spoken to the Solomons leader since the deal was inked last week, but sending a message loud and clear.
I share the same red line that the United States has. We won't be having Chinese military naval bases in our region on our doorstep.
The United States has warned it'll respond accordingly if China sets up a permanent military presence in the Solomon Islands. Australia is now ramping up its rhetoric, putting political pressure on the Solomons leader to pull back from this deal with Beijing. By articulating his red line, Scott Morrison would have to follow through, and Labor would now be weighing whether or not to match it. Jane Norman, ABC News, Canberra.
Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews says the debate about transgender students competing in school sport is cruel and it's being used to deflect from issues that really matter in the federal election. The Liberal candidate for the North Sydney seat of Warringah, Catherine Deeves, has campaigned to stop transgender people from competing in women's sport. Mr Andrews said professional and elite amateur sporting bodies have protocols for trans women and that no parent or teacher had ever raised the issue with him.
What's next? A trans girl can't play a female role in the school play? Like, is this the biggest issue in our nation today? I don't think it is.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison is standing by Ms Deeves, saying earlier this week that he would not allow her to be silenced. An emotional Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has fought through tears, saying he shares the pain of every Ukrainian who has lost children in Russia's war. It follows a horror rocket attack on civilian homes overnight, a woman and her 3-month-old baby among the dead. ABC correspondent Nick Dole reports from the capital, Kyiv.
A shocking strike in the heart of Odessa. Two apartment buildings hit by Russian missiles. The Ukrainian government says it was an attack designed to spread terror. Ukraine's armed forces say they shot down 2 of the 7 missiles. At least 2 hit military facilities. Firefighters guided survivors through flames and rubble. Many of the residents couldn't get through the collapsed levels under their own strength. Vitalia and her son Nikita were on the 12th floor.
There was a very strong explosion directly on top of us. It was impossible to breathe.
I got burned when flames hit me. I didn't feel it at first. I was in shock.
At least 8 people died, including a mother and her baby. Kira was just 3 months old.
The war started when this baby was 1 month old. Can you imagine what is happening? They are just bastards. I don't have any other words for it. Just bastards.
In a rare and at times emotional press conference at a train station in the capital, the Ukrainian president announced the US Secretaries of State and Defence would soon come to Ukraine in person. That visit here to the capital would be the first by a senior US government official since Russia's invasion of Ukraine began. President Zelensky says he'll be asking the Americans for more heavy weapons so his people can defend themselves in what's looking like an increasingly long and bloody conflict. Ukrainians are celebrating Orthodox Easter this Sunday. Here in central Kyiv, the faithful have brought food baskets for a traditional blessing. The Easter themes of suffering, sacrifice and resurrection have rarely been more poignant as this country fights for survival and prays for a new beginning.
Polls are open in France, with voters casting their ballot in the presidential runoff. Incumbent Emmanuel Macron is tipped to win a second term, with opinion polls placing him ahead of his far-right rival Marine Le Pen. According to the French Interior Ministry, turnout at midday Paris time stood at 26%. Now that's almost 2 points lower than the same time last election. Earlier we spoke to France 24's international affairs commentator Douglas Herbert. He says the high abstention rate could sway the outcome in either direction.
Many people have called abstention the third candidate in this election. In the first round, we had about a quarter of French voters basically, not bothering to show up at the polls, reflecting, indifference, apathy, but also sort of just general French disgruntlement with the state of politics and a real visceral sense that no matter who wins, it's not going to make a difference in their lives. So why even show up? And it's even worse among, younger people, sort of under 25. the rates of abstention start to really spike. And this is why both candidates have literally, in the final days before the election, obviously they haven't been allowed to campaign in the past, 48 hours before the actual vote today. But that's why they were pulling out all stops in the final days, crisscrossing France, and really, really stressing the absolute necessity to get out there, to go to the polls, because they, both of them reminded their voters that the polls, which, are constant and incessant here, as with a lot of elections, obviously, they're really just a snapshot, right, of public opinion at a particular instant in time. And they don't really, they're not scientific. They don't reflect what's actually going to happen on election day. So, weather can determine it. It happens to be relatively nice weather, at least where I am in the north of France this Sunday. But the problem is, and this sort of is the double whammy that could add to the abstention woes, is that a lot of France right now is on their Easter holiday. So you don't have a lot of voters in the places, where they normally would be going to the polls. It's a problem because, yes, you can appoint someone to vote by proxy for you, but, a lot of people don't really bother to do it, or they figure, well, I'm away, so I'm not going to go vote. Whatever. Too bad, I'll miss it. But no, it's a major concern here, and essentially, Marine Le Pen, she has absolutely believed, and she has fervently sort of, pressed this message all along, that if enough people are mobilized, as they say here, mobilisés, and show up at the polls, that she can pull off what would be at this point an upset. Because the polls, going into the blackout period on Friday midnight, were showing Emmanuel Macron with a 10 to 12 point lead, depending on which polls you look at. But a lot of that could swing on the mobilization, like I said. And I'll just note also that the candidate who placed third in the first round here, who was knocked out of the runoff, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's a far left candidate, he got 22% of the vote. It's a massive number of voters who could swing either way. Now, a lot of them seem to be going to Macron, but a lot of them also, polls suggest, are going to just sit out this vote and stay at home. And those voters have really been a target for both of these candidates to get them to show up and cast a ballot.
Externally, beyond France and its territories, what's at stake for the global order, for Europe, for NATO, for Australia, for the US, for security in both scenarios, if we had Le Pen or Macron?
That's a lot for one question. I'll tell you one thing. A lot of European leaders say basically what's at stake here is Europe. Europe is at stake. Marine Le Pen has tried to convince her voters that, in the last election, she wanted to pull France out of Europe. It was called Frexit. She wanted to pull it out of the European single currency, the euro currency, the euro. This election, she's dropped all that off the agenda. She says she's not going to pull France out of the EU, but what she wants is a Europe of nations. For a lot of European leaders, that is synonymous with no Europe at all. And she couldn't be more starkly at odds with Macron on this. Macron has built, it's been the foundation of his presidency, a more sovereign Europe, a more powerful Europe, a Europe that can work in harmony and together for its own economic, social, and defense issues. They are night and day here. There was I'll just end with the thought that, in Le Monde, one of the establishment most prominent papers here in France, 3 European leaders, Spain, Portugal, and Germany, this is unprecedented. They actually wrote an opinion to Le Monde pleading with French voters. They meddled right into the French campaign, pleading with voters not to vote for Marine Le Pen, to vote for Macron, saying that nothing less than Europe is at stake, and by extension also relations with the world, because Marine Le Pen has been known for being friendly with Vladimir Putin in the past. She says she wants to get back in touch with Russia as soon as the war is over and a peace treaty is signed, whatever that really means. So there are a lot of fears on that front as well. She's not a transatlantic president either. She doesn't have a lot of great love for the United States. It's very unclear what sort of foreign policy, if any, she really has in mind. But we do know that it resembles that of her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, France to the French. Even if she doesn't use that slogan anymore, it's very much a France first, sort of a Trumpian type of America first, but in this case, France first agenda, where Europe would be mostly an afterthought.
France 24 international affairs commentator Doug Herbert there. So first exit polls are expected at 8 p.m. Sunday, Paris time. Until then, French media are prohibited from quoting candidates or publishing polls to avoid unduly influencing voters. Returning home, stranded campers will spend another night in remote far north Queensland as late season rains drench the region. The campers are stuck near the Wenlock and Pasco rivers in Cape York. They're unable to cross the rivers that have turned into rapids. Help has been at hand though. A local chopper pilot evacuated a pregnant woman, children and some elderly locals and dropped off food as the remaining people there waited for the rivers to recede.
That's what's caught people out. You know, they're travelling up and it was reasonably dry, and they were able to access some of these places. And then, but once we started getting this rain, because everything is wet, it doesn't take much to bring those rivers up.
From the Daintree to the Cape, the region has seen heavy falls since Easter. Now to tonight's special report. The Anzac Day tradition began as a way to commemorate Australians killed in World War I. But more than a century on, we're still correcting a great disservice to the thousands of veterans who actually made it home. They later died with little recognition of their sacrifice to the conflict. At cemeteries in towns and cities across Australia, their final resting places remain unmarked. In fact, it's estimated there are more than 12,000 inferior graves across the country. Volunteers have been working on the immense task of restoring them, giving the returned the recognition they so deserve. Tonight, reporter Will Murray takes us to Oatlands in Tasmania, where the team is at a crossroads in the mission.
In the quiet town of Oatlands in central Tasmania, members of the armed forces have gathered to commemorate the life of a fellow soldier. But this is no ordinary service.
Before there was just a simple metal cross with G Hardwick painted very rustically, so it's lovely to see that he's finally being recognised as a soldier.
In 1963, Cornelius George Hardwick died of natural causes and was buried here at the age of 80. His unadorned grave gave no indication he'd risked his life for his country during the First World War.
The government made the promise to these men when they encouraged them to go away back in 16, 17, 18, that we will look after you when you come home. You make that kind of promise, and these men expected to be looked after, and they weren't really looked after.
If, like George Hardwick, their death wasn't attributable to their war service, their family received no financial support for a memorial.
He was just one of those who was basically forgotten about.
Andrea and Ron Gerard are members of the Headstone Project, an organisation which seeks to give deceased veterans who ended up in makeshift grave sites their overdue honours. A ceremony like this is thanks to their tireless research, fundraising and labour. Restoring George Hardwick's headstone and hundreds before him began here at Cornelian Bay in Hobart.
There's 9 of us. I think the youngest one's in the mid-50s. Most of them are 70 and above.
The not-for-profit organisation needs to source concrete, tools, labourers and plaques, amongst many other things. Every headstone restoration requires these volunteers to travel hundreds of kilometres. The gravesite needs to be prepared at least a week before the ceremony to ensure both the headstone and the plaque are secure. Over many years of doing this work, the Headstone Project have it all down to a fine art. And while the work is physically taxing, the sad circumstances of these lost soldiers keep the group motivated, determined to leave no one behind. Since 2010, the Headstone Project has restored more than 500 graves in Tasmania alone. At a cost of $750 each, that's a total cost of around $375,000. Now, while this organisation and others like them across the country used to receive government funding, that's no longer the case, and they estimate there are more than 10,000 left to do.
At the moment, we're using whatever reserves we've got, so I've tried to be very careful and keep some money aside.
They're desperate to secure long-term funding before they and the rest of their team become too old to carry on.
We would like to keep the project going, but the age of our volunteers is prohibitive of that.
And if they can't find the money or the volunteers, what happens next?
I don't know. I wouldn't like to think that one.
No, we don't like that thought. But basically, I guess the project will just fold up.
Without them, thousands of soldiers' graves will remain unmarked, their history of service buried with them. 100 years ago, George Hardwick put his life on the line for his country. Finally, the time has come to lay him to rest. Halfway across the world, he witnessed things that we can only imagine. Although the conflict didn't take his life, the lasting effects of World War I shaped the rest of it. He died in a small town with no close family and no recognition of the sacrifice he made.
I'd like to leave a legacy that says that we care, that we're a group of people who try to do something in a positive and in a real way. Why should they miss out when others have got a headstone? They're all heroes for me.
These guys deserve to be remembered.
In the AFL, Geelong had a welcome return to form, defeating North Melbourne by 60 points in Tasmania. Forward Jeremy Cameron kicked 7 goals, which is his highest tally since joining the Cats, and the highest number kicked at Bellerive Oval. Meanwhile, Brisbane secured another win against Gold Coast on what was a wet Anzac Day Eve.
More than just state pride was on the line as the Lions took on the Suns in the Q clash, starting on a sombre note. Having lost their last 6 clashes against Brisbane, the Suns were facing an uphill battle. They would also need to compete against the elements as rain soon added an extra layer of difficulty. Brisbane's Kai Lohmann, an unfortunate casualty, needing to be subbed out due to an ankle injury.
Gee, that was an aggressive tackle, wasn't it?
Well, I hope he's okay. There was a horrible sound when he hit the ground.
The slippery conditions made for some interesting moments.
He's kicked his boot off. It almost went as far as the Sharon.
And despite spirited play from the Suns, the Lions saw them off, thanks in part to a personal best 6 goals from Zach Bailey, the win helping to solidify their spot in the top 4. Meanwhile, coming off a shock loss against the Hawks last week, the finals contending Cats were looking to get back on track against a young Kangaroos side in Tasmania, and early on it was Geelong's experience which shone through.
Can he gather? He does. Can he scoot away? He can. Can he kick the goal? You bet!
Despite missing star midfielder Patrick Dangerfield due to injury, the Cats dominated early in the game. Wanting to avoid a repeat of their previous efforts, North Melbourne tried to push back, but Geelong capitalised on turnovers as their forwards continued to get chances. Jeremy Cameron surpassing the record for most goals kicked at Blundstone Arena on his way to a 7-goal day.
Cameron, Walker, Cameron, little back flick, gets it back. Bizarre but beautiful.
A 5-goal final quarter restored some respectability to the scoreline for the Roos, but it was too little too late as Geelong came away 60-point winners. Fraser Fife, ABC News.
In round 7 of the NRL, the Newcastle Knights have been humiliated by ruthless Parramatta Eels, going down 6 tries to none in front of a packed crowd at Newcastle Stadium. It was a much happier home crowd though in Perth, with the Panthers notching up their 7th straight win, beating the Canberra Raiders there 36-6 to stay on top of the NRL ladder.
Emotions ran high as Penrith and Canberra walked side by side in a show of unity ahead of Anzac Day. Panthers flicked a switch in the second half, crossing for 5 unanswered tries.
Luai takes it himself.
They're queuing up now on that left-hand side.
The full-time score 36-6. Kalen Ponga was out to prove his worth after signing a mega $5 million deal with the Knights. But it was Newcastle's poor trailing by 12 points.
Such an obvious dressing room that's united and playing so well for each other.
I was going to make a similar point around Jackson Hastings to himself. It's a redemption story. He left the Roosters, he left Manly with a query around his capacity to find relationships with other players. He was a divisive figure within those camps. He went away to the Super League in exile from the NRL. He won a Man of Steel over there. He played in grand finals. He comes back, he's reinvented himself, and he seems almost the glue in that partnership. You listen to him speak about how much he loves playing with Luke Brooks, and he's loving his chance to play for the Tigers and be back with his family again. He's a terrific story of the season.
Georgina, you're Brisbane-based these days, and the second team in Brisbane, Wayne Bennett's team, they're called the Dolphins. They still can't land a big fish. Munster we spoke about for about half the show last week, and Kalen Ponga was all the headlines this week. He's decided to stay at Newcastle, but a typical contract saga in rugby league that was dirty, it was messy, it dominated the headlines.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was ever going to go any other way than the way it went. I think, you know, he is so inextricably tied up, particularly through the influence of his father with the Newcastle Knights. It is a really interesting point to make about the Dolphins and Wayne Bennett. It's a test for the master coach, you know, one of the greatest the game's ever seen, to put together a roster. There isn't a lot of coverage of the Dolphins. You know, I guess that they're still a season out from starting, but, you know, it's still a Broncos city. So Wayne Bennett, I think the pressure is on to land that fish, or they'll be the narwhal, the unicorn of the sea.
It's almost a bit of a test for expansion too, isn't it? I mean, we're seeing it in the AFLW at the moment as well. We've had a number of key players recommit to their current clubs this week. We know, you know, Hawthorn and Sydney, they were right firmly in the market for Emily Bates out of the Lions, and she stayed. And I sort of wonder whether maybe it's the COVID effect. You know, people are quite happy to stick with where they are, and you hope not for Wayne Bennett's sake. You'd hope that he's going to land someone eventually, but whether sort of safe is the option now.
Yeah, I'd back Wayne Bennett to assemble a roster. And I mean, his greatest gift as a coach has been to develop players and bring them through. So I'm sure he will also be able to take a roster and do something special with it.
OK, so we had the 1 point thriller and upset last night in rugby league. We had one in AFL yesterday as well at Ballarat. At the end of last year, the former Crows captain Taylor Walker looked like he might be a dead man walking after making a racist comment. He was forced to apologise. Some wondered whether the Crows would actually sack him. Instead, he was suspended for 6 weeks. Now, in his 3 games back, he's got 3 best on grounds, 5 goals in an upset win over Richmond, 3 goals yesterday in Ballarat. This was a boil-over, 1 point win against the Bulldogs, including the Sealer. He's now the hero of this team. How do we feel about celebrating Taylor Walker?
Yeah, it's a bit of an awkward one, isn't it, Kelly? And I'm interested to get Al's perspective on this, obviously, as a broadcaster in these sort of moments. He kicked his 500th goal yesterday, as you said, the match winner. The Rat sort of typically throws up some interesting results and interesting weather systems too, no less. But it is creating a bit of an awkward situation for the league, isn't it, Al? Of this sort of balancing, you know, we're still recognising what Taylor did and what he said. He's obviously served his suspension. We understand he's doing a lot of work behind the scenes on working on this sort of thing. But these awkward moments are just going to keep popping up, aren't they, as he keeps performing like this, probably right through to Brownlow night.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think Taylor Walker needs to tread a careful line himself. He needs to come across as someone who's been reflective, who's taken a look at the way they behave, taken a look at their beliefs and tried to get better. And I think he's gone away and done that, and he served a 6-week suspension. But I think he needs to be careful with his own language. I didn't think it was a particularly good look last week when he was complaining about Trent Cotchin's kicking action against him, to say that if it would have been him, he would have been suspended. I just think he's got to go quietly about his business and do exactly what he is doing on the field and let his football do the talking. I think he served his 6-week punishment. He's got to be allowed to become a better person. And you have to give him credit for what he's done. 2 years ago, Taylor Walker looked like his career was over. He wasn't playing good football anymore. Last year, he kicked 48 goals. He was back. He's come through this period of mass shame and had the total scrutiny of the entire football world upon him for his behaviour, which was deplorable. And now he's come the other side and he's playing really well. So I think you have to commend him for that.
And not just playing really well, I mean, playing arguably some of the best football of his career. Couldn't play in any intra-club, that was cancelled because of COVID. So he hasn't actually couldn't play in any matches, lower levels or anything like that. I guess the point is, Georgina, he cannot redeem himself on the field, can he? But he has served his time, he's apologised, and there's a point where you all want to move on. He deserves to be back. Does he deserve to be celebrated as a hero? That's what's uncomfortable about it.
Well, isn't that the fundamental uncomfortable truth about these concepts of heroism and sporting heroes, that people aren't perfect all the time? You know, this is the complexity of human frailty. This is a magnificent footballer who made a very, very nasty comment in a casual way without any consciousness of it being a nasty comment, and has had to endure that scrutiny of the football community and the ridicule and the scorn, and is clawing his way back. I mean, heroes, it's a funny thing. I think I talk about this a lot ad nauseum on this show when I'm on. People are human, and we should be really careful about elevating people to hero status, because the fall is great.
And the wider fallout, too, of a situation like this. We talk about the education piece, Al, and the work that Taylor has done. I think it's important in that respect too, Georgina, that we do keep talking about it and acknowledging these uncomfortable and potentially awkward moments. It keeps that conversation going and then reinforces that, you know, this is a really important conversation. We talk about the trickle-down effect from the AFL, that these conversations are actually being had.
Crows weren't tipped to make the 8. They're now 3-3, but the surprise packet for the season is the Fremantle Football Club. They're second on the ladder, 5 wins, 1 loss, 35-point winners over the Blues. All the while their crosstown rivals, the West Coast Eagles, the powerhouse, are bottom after an 84-point loss to Port Adelaide.
Yeah, the contrast is massive. West Coast is the big club in the town, similar to the Brisbane Broncos and the Dolphins will be when they come in, or the Gold Coast Titans. It's a Queensland club down the road from the Broncos as well. But the Eagles were completely humiliated yesterday by Port Adelaide, a team that hadn't won a game this season. They kicked the opening goal of the game, then went the best part of 90 minutes of playing time without kicking another. And Port just dismantled them. You contrast that with Fremantle, who looks so well drilled under Justin Longmuir. He's built in the defensive layers. He's now adding the attacking component to their game. And they look very capable. They're going to play in the finals, there's no doubt about it, with the start they've got and the way they're playing. And they have this beautiful blend of young players who are stepping up. Brayshaw, Sarong in the midfield. Brodie's been a brilliant pickup. And then David Mundy, the evergreen David Mundy, who's now played the 13th most games in the competition, went past Gary Ablett Jr. yesterday and continues to contribute to a very high standard every week. I love what they're doing, plus their defence as well, Lauren, yesterday was superb. Brendan Cox has been brilliant. Alex Pearce-Kell as well, coming back from injury. I think they can do some damage. Can they win the premiership? I don't think so, but they're taking massive steps towards maybe winning one.
They've certainly emerged as the season's surprise packet. All eyes this weekend, Lauren, were on the AFL umpires. Some would say the poor old AFL umpires. After this intense debate during the week about player dissent and after controversial calls on the ground. Now, a lack of umpiring at the country levels, community levels, all the way through means that the AFL has told their players to basically cut back on the back chat, and there has been one 50-metre penalty being given this weekend. It was St Kilda's Daniel McKenzie. Here he is disagreeing with the umpire. So he's just pointing down, basically saying, no, that shouldn't have been paid. As a result, he's given away a 50. Al, what do you make of it?
I think the intention of the rule is excellent. I think everyone would agree that there has been too much back chat to umpires, and the filter-down effect is massive down to grassroots football, but the execution of it has been way off the mark, and the inconsistency in the application of the rule as well. If you look at the very meaning of dissent, it essentially means to disagree with the commonly held view or the official view. Now, in this case, the umpire holds the official view, so you're essentially saying you cannot express any disagreement with the umpire whatsoever. And the problem is we're seeing multiple instances where players clearly do that, and they are not penalised 50 metres. So if you're going to introduce a polarising kind of rule like this, then it has to be consistently applied. We've got enough grey in AFL that frustrates fans as it is without adding this and putting pressure on the umpires who ultimately are going to bear the brunt of the fans' anger.
Isn't it an easier rule to police if you just make the blanket ban? I mean, as soon as you start sort of ignoring some or saying, oh, that one's OK, then it gets confusing. I think players just have to get out of the habit. It is a problem. It's emerging. The AFL's hitting it on their head now. Of course, you know, they've been doing this since under 12s. They'll learn very, very quickly. I don't mind it. I think they have to actually blow the whistle and say...
I'm with you, provided it's consistently applied, and that clearly isn't happening.
That's the problem, isn't it? And I heard Lee Matthews speak yesterday and said, you talk about the poor old umpires. He said, if I was an AFL umpire, I'd be really peed off. And with what's happened, the spotlight's on them, we're all sort of waiting with bated breath, aren't we? Every time that whistle goes, you think, oh, what's going to happen here? But it comes down to consistency. I'm with you, Kel. I think it's been a blanket ban in an effort to almost take it a little bit further than it potentially needed to go, in the sense that there is that little bit of room to then sort of loosen it off a bit and allow for situations like Daniel McKenzie's where he's just saying it hit the ground. And I saw it hit the ground. So I think the intent of the rule, as you say, Al, is the right one. We even see coaches in the coaches box are disputing decisions and all the rest of it. The trickle-down effect, as we mentioned earlier, is evident, and that's what the AFL's clearly going for. They're lacking umpires at the junior level and the local level, obviously with the explosion of women's football as well. There's more matches. I just don't think that this is the silver bullet that's going to fix all of our umpiring troubles in those lower levels. I think it goes a lot sort of wider than that. There's issues about pay, about pathways. I don't think this is the ultimate fix, but as you say, Al, the intention is the right one.
It sounds to me, I'd venture that it's the tip of the iceberg. Caroline Wilson wrote a chilling analysis of the status of umpires in the AFL. Things like field umpires no longer regularly train together, no longer have access to a gym, and until round 3 of this season were banned from using the Marvel Stadium ground, which last year became their new coaching base. That's pariah status in a game that absolutely depends on them. And the football boss Dylan told clubs in February the game is 6,000 umpires short at local level and identified on-field abuse as the main reason for the crisis. I mean, bring them back into the fold, treat them the way they need to be treated. The on-field obsession, it's important, but there's some pretty nasty stuff going on behind the scenes.
And they will not walk back on this. They can't. So they have to maintain it. I think it's just players just have to get used to it. I mean, that Daniel McKenzie one, he was disagreeing. He was disagreeing with the umpire.
And so exactly, and don't do it. Have you ever seen an umpire change their mind? Do not do it. But if he is going to be penalised 50-metre penalties, Braden Pruce needs to be, Jack Long needs to be.
Blow the whistle, move on. Players will get used to it very, very quickly. Super Rugby is doing the Rugby League Magic Round, which when it takes it to Brisbane, Super Rugby is taking it to Melbourne. It's a good idea this weekend because there hasn't been any AFL or Rugby League yet in Melbourne played.
No.
So it's your sport that's dominating at the Melbourne Rectangular Ground there, and the jewel in the crown was the Super W Grand Final yesterday, which was, if this team's not the most amazing team going around at the moment, the Fijiana Drua playing the Waratahs in the Grand Final. You were there, Georgina. You tell us what happened.
Vitalina Naikore, not that player, another winger, scored a hat-trick in the Druas' win over New South Wales. She was playing football, had not picked up a rugby ball, apart from as a kid on the beach, until last year and was spotted as a talent ID camp. And she scored 3 tries yesterday. This New South Wales team, to put it in perspective, for 5 seasons of Super W, had not lost a game until the Fijiana entered the competition this year, and they beat them last in their regular round matchup, and they beat them in the grand final. The only 2 losses the New South Wales women have ever conceded. It was a magnificent spectacle, and it was a Fiji home game because all of the Fijians and Pacific Islander Australians came to Amy Park and absolutely shouted them home.
You wrote last night that the New South Wales Waratahs, the men's team, played and lost in Melbourne on Friday night. Not one player stuck around to watch their women play in a grand final. I just find that extraordinary. Why not?
There's some context that's important, and it's pointed out in the story. This was only moved from Sydney to Amy Park because Super Round is here 4 weeks ago or 3.5 weeks ago. Now, the New South Wales Waratahs chief executive said we looked into changing flights. It was too expensive. It was $300 per person. Sure, for a travelling team of 40 people, that's $12,000.
Wasn't the captain here yesterday having lunch?
The captain was in Melbourne yesterday,
right.
The captain of the Wallabies was in Melbourne having lunch. That's what he told us when we published this article. But the New South Wales captain also was in Melbourne, certainly in the morning at around midday, but didn't respond to our requests for comment. So it was the too hard basket for them. I say. The chairman and the chief executive were there, but make more of an effort.
It's not a good one for the optics, is it? Like, I bring it back to, obviously, the AFL Women's, which is sort of the closest to my sort of beat. We had the Melbourne Football Club, their female team played in a preliminary final at the MCG. They were all there. Geelong Cat. You could sort of name just about every AFLW team where the men's players are often seen, as you say, in their spare time, just standing in the outer with their kids and watching the AFLW counterparts play. It's just the look factor, isn't it?
And the women, I asked the women's captain, Grace Hamilton, last night about it, and she's too gracious. She said, we feel really well supported by the men, and that's wonderful. But when the rubber hits the road, it's they're club teammates. It's the women and the men in any sport. When there's a grand final for one of your divisions, one of your grades, you all get down there and support them. But it was put in the too hard basket. The players didn't have a choice apart from the two who remained in Melbourne and decided not to go to the game. And hopefully they'll sort of explain that in coming days. But the hierarchy of the team, the chief executive, the chairman, should have stood up and said that's not good enough. Send 5 players down.
Absolutely. So there's 12 teams, 6 games all up, and it's Australia playing New Zealand for the first time this season.
Yeah.
We're 0 from 2. The Reds led 17-0 at one point, and you did think last night, here we go, Australia's going to beat New Zealand for the first time this season in this comp, but no.
This was a great match. I mean, for the 40 minutes and for longer, actually, it was an excellent match. There were 2 tries to the Reds, Hamish Stewart and Fraser McWright, but it was the last points they scored, and then it was all the other way. The Hurricanes just sort of romped it home, and the Reds really lacked leadership. James O'Connor, their Wallabies number 10, is out for a month, so they really missed his maturity when the Hurricanes scored a try right before half-time, and then they had the break and they scored another one right after half-time, and that's the killer.
Brumbies later this afternoon, fingers crossed, maybe.
Yeah, no, absolutely, they're in with a chance.
OK. The Reds coach, Brad Thorne, publicly declared recently that he would like to be the Wallabies coach, and fair to say that it's ruffled some feathers, Georgina.
It ruffled some feathers, it sure did. I'll tell you what really ruffled feathers was an unnamed but high-placed Rugby Australia source saying that Brad Thorne wasn't a team player and had a lot of work to do if he wanted to be considered a contender. That didn't go well north of the border in Fortress, Queensland. But look, the backstory to this is that there's an heir apparent that isn't officially the heir apparent, but is considered the likely successor to Dave Rennie. He's the Brumbies coach, Dan McKellar, and I think it's healthy competition. And Dan McKellar is a competitive animal. He wouldn't want to be given the job. He wants to earn it. So Brad Thorne said, look, I'd also like to be considered. And that's monumental because until about a month ago or 2 months ago, no one knew. This guy's a World Cup winning All Black, an Origin great, a Broncos great, and no one knew whether he wanted to coach the All Blacks, whether he wanted to coach Queensland in rugby league, or whether he wanted to coach the Wallabies. So, it's actually a great story for rugby that one of the greatest ever players wants to coach Australia.
Great story happening in basketball at the moment, and you, originally from Tasmania, would more than happily talk us through this. I'm wearing the colour of the Jack Jumpers today because I watched this last night. So after 147 games of the NBL season, it comes down to the final game today to decide the last spot in the top 4. Perth Wildcats, if they win, they make their 36th consecutive year of playoffs. But if Phoenix win, the Jack Jumpers in their debut season make the top 4.
And you're looking at the coach of the season right there, Scott Roth, in his first season in charge, has been brilliant. And for the Jack Jumpers to even be in this position where they might make the finals, given the start they had, given they're a new team in the competition, They're swept up in jumper mania down in Tasmania at the moment. They are selling out the stadium, and I think it would be terrific to see them play finals. The Wildcats have been excellent, so let's see what they do this afternoon. But Melbourne United, best team in the competition, heaviest defeat they've suffered, albeit without Matt Dellavedova, and they were resting a couple of players at times within the game as well. But that was such a strong performance, and I think it's a great example to the AFL about a Tassie team and how successful it can be.
I knew you'd mention that. Lauren Jackson is 40. She's given birth to 2 children in the last 5 or 6 years. She is back. 22 minutes, 21 points, 5 rebounds, playing for the Border Bandits in a win last night up in near our hometown.
Yeah, it's an incredible story, isn't it, Kelly? Just watching her here, she absolutely dominated and I've got to catch myself here. The Albury-Wodonga Bandits. I keep going to call them the BMX Bandits at every opportunity, so I've got to catch myself there. But she got the exemption for use of medicinal cannabis earlier to allow her to play in the NBL 1 competition, and it certainly got everyone talking about, you know, could there be another berth in the Opals team? Obviously, Liz Cambridge is out of the fold there. I don't know. I think is it maybe a bridge too far? But watching her last night, she just looked unbelievable.
Well, Sandy Brondello certainly hasn't ruled it out.
If it's not ruled out, it's potentially ruled in.
The last time I saw Lauren Jackson, she could barely lift because her knees were so dodgy. Get up off the chair to make her way out of the cafe. So it's quite extraordinary.
Engrossed in the conversation.
Well, you know, Wimbledon begins in June, and the All England club is in a very tough political spot this week. It banned players from Russia and Belarus for their country's role in the Ukraine war. That means world number 2 Daniil Medvedev and former Australian Open champion Victoria Azarenka and world number 5 Irina Sabalenka won't play. The men's and women's tours aren't happy, and Novak Djokovic says the decision is absolutely crazy. What do we make of it, Lauren?
Oh, well, I think it's one of those situations, isn't it? We never like to mix sport and politics, but we've never had an era quite like it where the two have really gone head-to-head. I mean, this is the influence of the British government. Maybe they've seen what happened at the Australian Open with Novak Djokovic and they've elected to make the call early, maybe sort of get everyone a little bit used to the decision. They've left it open, Wimbledon. There was one line in their statement that said they could sort of readdress it closer. It's left the players incredibly unhappy, particularly those top players you mentioned. Andrei Rublev spoke out during the week offering to, if one of them won it, you know, donate all of their prize money to the situation in Ukraine. The interesting line I noticed was the mention of the royal family being embroiled, as if they don't have enough going on at the moment. But obviously Kate Middleton is the patron of Wimbledon. She has to present the trophy to the winners. You know, whether that could end up being used as propaganda by the Russian government. There's so many layers to this, and I don't think this is going to be a story that goes away anytime soon.
It's almost like they've looked at what happened with the Australian Open. Craig Tiley was clearly dreading the moment that he hands over the trophy to Novak Djokovic, who wasn't vaxxed and would have played here, and how that would have been received around the world. How's it received if Kate Middleton's handing over the Wimbledon trophy to Sabalenka, who was a semi-finalist at Wimbledon last year?
Well, Lauren used the word optics before. I think that's got a lot to do with it. I think what's happening in Ukraine is horrifying to everyone, but, gee, it's a harsh penalty to discriminate against individuals who aren't representing Russia. They're representing themselves. I think the WTA, the ITF and also all of those organisational bodies around the team tournaments have taken the right stance. Russia's not allowed to compete, but when Andrei Rublev and also Anastasia Pavlyuchenkova have denounced the war and aren't allowed to play, I think that's extremely harsh.
OK, from extremely harsh, final tip or observation, take us away.
This was a bit harsh because watching the great man knock out his opponent in the 6th round earlier today was quite something. Now,
Tyson Fury.
Tyson Fury is his name, and he was taking on Dillian White, WBC champion, knocked him out in the 6th round, and then Wembley's known for its great concerts. He put on this little performance in the aftermath.
Tyson, just one last question, just a word to these people.
I'll give you more than a word.
Go on, Tyson.
I'll give you something that goes like this. A long, long time ago, I can still remember how that music used to make me smile. All together now! So bye-bye, Miss American Pie. But the levee was dry. Them good old boys were singing whiskey and wine, singing this will be the day that I die.
Some might find it hard to remember his name. That was an unforgettable performance, Kelly. That was quite something. And how random.
Oh, so
More
random.
of it, please.
We could have played the whole 5 minutes, but we wouldn't put our viewers through it. Georgina.
It's hard to follow that. Listen, it's basically the rematch in 3 weeks. The Wallaroos, the women's 15 test side, play the Fiji test side, which will have a lot of the same faces as the Fijiana team. They've got 3 weeks.
Fantastic to see too. Just a quick one on Barcelona. Twice in a month they've broken their own record for crowd at a female sporting event. And
extraordinary.
In a week where I think we could get an AFLW pay deal, they are really setting the standard over in Spain, aren't they?
They are, and we look forward to that pay deal being done. There were a few eyebrows raised this week when Australian netball coach Stacey Marinkovic named her preliminary squad for the Commonwealth Games in July, but it was great to see Queensland Firebird shooter Danelle Wallam included. Now, if she makes the final cut, she'll be the first Indigenous woman to play for the Diamonds in 22 years. Wonderful story. That is the show for this Sunday. Thanks to the panel for coming in particular to our rugby expert Georgina for making the trip down from Brisbane. As a parting gift, here's a touching moment involving 2 junior rugby players in England and a reminder of what being a good teammate is all about. See you next Sunday.
It's okay.
Everyone's older than me. Everyone's bigger.
You don't have to tackle.
Bob, listen to me. No, Bob, listen to me. Trust me. Look at me. Look at me, Bob. I'm the shortest kid here. Listen, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're short, you're young. It doesn't matter if you're tall or hit. It doesn't matter if you're fat. It doesn't matter if you're tall. Bob, you are a brilliant rugby player. You understand that? You're insane. You're actually insane for your age. You're insane. Come here, give me a hug.
Best teammate ever.
All right?
Best teammate.
You're really good.
Come on.
Come on. So come on. No one. It doesn't matter if
It doesn't change who you are.
The Prime Minister told Parliament
Justice and humanity.
And welcome to our viewers around the world. I'm Michael Oku. We begin in France, where voters are casting their ballots in a tightly contested presidential election runoff. Opinion polls suggest pro-Europe Emmanuel Macron is on course for another 5-year term in the Élysée Palace. But his far-right opponent, Marine Le Pen, has mounted a strong challenge. Victory for her could shake the foundations of European unity.
It's election day, and France is bracing for the Le Pen-Macron showdown. The stakes are huge. Le Pen would become modern France's first far-right leader and first female president. Macron would be the first French president to win re-election in 2 decades. Much will depend on how many people will show up to vote in a country that's deeply divided. I'm not a fan of Macron, but I think it's the only democratic option. We have seen how they have restricted our freedoms these last years, especially during the pandemic. I'm not sure people are aware of this, but I think, unfortunately, we will continue on this path if Macron is re-elected. It's the supporters of left-wing candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who came third in round 1, who feel particularly frustrated they no longer have a left-wing option. Now their vote, or a low turnout, has the potential to tip the scales. Macron has tried to appeal to these voters by toning down parts of his manifesto, like the plan to push up the retirement age from the current 62 to 65.
We can fix a lower target age. I am open to discussion.
Meanwhile, Le Pen has also tried to gather more support by continuing to depict herself as the candidate closest to the people.
I want to tell every French person that my project is tailor-made for them. I want them to be happy, prosperous, safe, and I will defend their identity.
All opinion polls in recent days point towards a win for the 44-year-old pro-European centrist Macron. A Le Pen victory, however, is still possible and would send shockwaves across Europe.
Lisa Lewis is in Paris for us. I asked her what mood she's sensing from voters today. Stay the course or bring on change?
Well, the people I've been talking to have been telling me that it's important for them to actually block Marine Le Pen from getting to power. Some are convinced that Emmanuel Macron will adapt his course, his programme, more to left-wing voters, because he's seen that Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far-left candidate, scored quite well in the first round of voting, and they think that Emmanuel Macron has understood that he needs to change his programme, introduce more social measures, more ecological measures actually to satisfy those voters. Other people have told me that they are not really happy about voting for Emmanuel Macron, but that they feel that there is no other option for them. Mind you, the people I've been talking to have all said that they would vote for Macron, or at least the others have not revealed to me that they would vote for Marine Le Pen. But this is really very much Macron heartland here in Paris, because Macron has scored quite well in big cities, and Marine Le Pen would rather score well in the countryside. That's at least what happened in the first round of voting 2 weeks ago.
We've heard it certainly for weeks now. Macron is expected to win, but I imagine not a few people are on the edge of their seats wondering if there'll be a surprise tonight, especially if the unusually large number of undecided voters sit this election out, in which case I suppose anything could happen.
Well, absolutely, you're right, especially as there were polls showing a few weeks ago that there could be a neck race between the two candidates. That wasn't the case 5 years ago in 2017, when everybody, all the pollsters and analysts here in France were saying there's no chance that Marine Le Pen could win. Now the polls have changed again over the past 2 weeks, and Emmanuel Macron has increased his lead. But as you're saying, there are two variables that could change the outcome. Very low voting participation, or those that haven't decided who they would vote for yet. Actually, these 10% of voters.
This is the second time that Macron and Le Pen are facing each other in the runoff. Remind us, what's different this time?
Well, what's different is that Marine Le Pen has been, she managed to increase the share of the voters that would vote for her. Over the past few months, she's been campaigning through towns, through markets, telling everybody that, she was the candidate closest to the people, the candidate that would increase her spending power. She was also helped by another candidate called Éric Zemmour, who seemed even further to the right. He was campaigning very much with outright racist slogans, and so that had Marine Le Pen appear soft. And thirdly, Emmanuel Macron really stayed away from the campaign trail for a long time, until the first round of voting, that is, because then he understood that he needed to do more actually to win over voters' hearts. But the bottom line of this is really that Marine Le Pen has now, maybe the polls are not predicting that she will win this election, but her share of the vote could be a lot higher than 5 years ago, when she was already facing Emmanuel Macron in the runoff vote. And that means that Emmanuel Macron really needs to do something to bring this country back together, to satisfy those voters who only vote for him today, to prevent Marine Le Pen from getting to power.
No doubt we'll be seeing a lot more of you in the coming hours. DW correspondent Lisa Lewis, thank you. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is due to meet with top U.S. officials in the coming hours. Zelensky says he'll be asking Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin for more weapons to fight the Russian Bundesliga champions. They've sealed a record 10th German title with victory over Dortmund. Robert Lewandowski was among the goal scorers against his former club as Bayern ran out 3-1 winners. It's a first Bundesliga title for their coach Julian Nagelsmann at just 34 years old. You're watching DW News. Is a reminder of our top story at this hour. Opinion polls suggest French President Emmanuel Macron is on course for a second 5-year term. But his far-right opponent, Marine Le Pen, has mounted a strong challenge in Sunday's election runoff. Again, DW News live in Berlin. Our documentary series Doc Film is coming up next. This time about one of the world's best-known railways, the Glacier Express. And there's plenty more on our website, dw.com. Michael Loku in Berlin. More news at the top of the next hour.
Top-end time for the election campaign, but the Solomons weighs heavily on the agenda. A mother and child killed by a horrific attack in a once safe Ukrainian city. And France votes. Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen cast their ballots as the country has its say. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Mariam Saab. The Prime Minister has issued a warning to the Solomon Islands, declaring that he won't allow China to set up a permanent military base on Australia's doorstep. Scott Morrison is continuing to face questions on the campaign trail, with Labor blaming him for the controversial security pact. Here's political reporter Jane Norman.
Welcome. Hello, Penny. I'm Meredith, the town crier of Alice Springs.
A campaign clash in the Red Centre. After refusing to front the media yesterday, today the Prime Minister returned to his campaign theme, the economy, with a $300 million investment in gas and clean energy projects in the Territory.
There are some loud voices out there today, but there are many, many quiet voices all around this country which want to ensure that we have a strong economy.
But yet again, a controversial Liberal candidate is proving a distraction.
I have received death threats. My family are away out of Sydney because I don't want them to witness what I am going through.
Catherine Deeve's record of transphobic and offensive remarks has made her a target, but she found an ally on the campaign trail.
Being pro-women is not anti-trans as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks very much.
On the eve of Anzac Day, Labor pledged a $500 million boost to support for veterans.
To repair a decade of damage.
Their leaders still in isolation, Labor's Mark Butler and Penny Wong took centre stage on day 14, keeping up the pressure on the coalition for failing to stop a security pact that could see China gain a foothold in Australia's backyard.
That has demonstrably made Australia, the region, less secure and Australians less secure.
Labor argues a decade of cuts to foreign aid spending has undermined Australia's authority and influence.
You will see more resources and more energy from a Labor government in the Pacific.
Australia is still the biggest donor in the Pacific, with $1.7 billion set aside for the region. Solomon Islands receives about $170 million of that, but the figure has fallen dramatically since the end of Ramsay, Australia's multi-year assistance mission, putting the country behind Papua New Guinea and Fiji.
The Australian government's support for the Solomons has been very effective. All I can tell you is the Chinese government does not play by the same rules.
The Prime Minister confirming he hasn't spoken to the Solomons leader since the deal was inked last week, but sending a message loud and clear.
I share the same red line that the United States has. We won't be having Chinese military naval bases in our region on our doorstep.
The United States has warned it'll respond accordingly if China sets up a permanent military presence in the Solomon Islands. Australia is now ramping up its rhetoric, putting political pressure on the Solomons leader to pull back from this deal with Beijing. By articulating his red line, Scott Morrison would have to follow through, and Labor would now be weighing whether or not to match it. Jane Norman, ABC News, Canberra.
An emotional Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has fought through tears, saying that he shares the pain of every Ukrainian who has lost children in Russia's war. It follows a horror rocket attack on civilian homes, with a woman and her 3-month-old baby among the dead. ABC correspondent Nick Dole reports from the capital, Kyiv.
A shocking strike in the heart of Odessa. Two apartment buildings hit by Russian missiles. The Ukrainian government says it was an attack designed to spread terror. Ukraine's armed forces say they shot down 2 of the 7 missiles. At least 2 hit military facilities. Firefighters guided survivors through flames and rubble. Many of the residents couldn't get through the collapsed levels under their own strength. Vitalia and her son Nikita were on the 12th floor.
There was a very strong explosion directly on top of us. It was impossible to breathe.
I got burned when flames hit me. I didn't feel it at first. I was in shock.
At least 8 people died, including a mother and her baby. Kira was just 3 months old.
The war started when this baby was 1 month old. Can you imagine what is happening? They are just bastards. I don't have any other words for it. Just bastards.
In a rare and at times emotional press conference at a train station in the capital, the Ukrainian president announced the US Secretaries of State and Defence would soon come to Ukraine in person. That visit here to the capital would be the first by a senior US government official since Russia's invasion of Ukraine began. President Zelensky says he'll be asking the Americans for more heavy weapons so his people can defend themselves in what's looking like an increasingly long and bloody conflict. Ukrainians are celebrating Orthodox Easter this Sunday. Here in central Kiev, the faithful have brought food baskets for a traditional blessing. The Easter themes of suffering, sacrifice and resurrection have rarely been more poignant as this country fights for survival and prays for a new beginning.
Australia's Ukrainian population have gathered to mark Orthodox Easter. They were joined by those who recently fled their homeland after Russia's invasion. Worshippers used the occasion as an opportunity to reflect on the war back home and look toward a peaceful, more hopeful future.
Orthodox Easter recognises the triumph of light over darkness.
A light that cannot be overcome.
At this packed Ukrainian service in Sydney's west, the sentiment felt especially close to home, with a focus on those living through the horrors of war.
Let's pray that Ukraine will overcome her enemies quickly.
Among the crowd, some of Australia's newest residents. Ina and her 8-year-old son Andre made the journey from Kyiv last month, travelling through Poland, Austria and Dubai to get to Sydney.
It was very hard journey, but now we feel safe and we can breathe safe.
Her 20-year-old daughter is still in Austria, her husband and parents still in Ukraine.
I want to hug my parents very much because now they are in a very difficult situation.
14-year-old Sophia arrived from Donetsk just 3 days ago.
I have my first flight. So it was really wow.
The stream of displaced people is constant. Over 6,000 visas have been approved. Only 1,700 of those approved applicants have arrived in Australia, so there are still 4,000 and more that will come.
For Ukrainians who have only just arrived in Australia, this Easter Sunday is especially important. A reminder that they have community and support as they adjust to life in a new country.
We have many help from different people who we don't know.
I hope that I will meet with my family very soon.
Until then, these familiar traditions bring some comfort, even on the other side of the world. Ruby Cornish, ABC News, Sydney.
Voters in France have been casting their ballots to decide who'll be the country's next president. Emmanuel Macron is the favourite to win against far-right National Rally Party candidate Marine Le Pen. But there are concerns that low voter turnout could lead to a shock result. At midday Paris time on Sunday, 26.1% of the voters had cast their ballot, almost 2 points lower than the same time last election. Now, much of the campaign has been dominated by cost of living pressures, with Ms Le Pen vowing to cut taxes on energy and food, while Mr Macron has tried to remind voters of Ms Le Pen's support for President Putin. And back home, stranded campers will spend another night in remote far north Queensland as late season rains drench the region. The campers are stuck near the Wenlock and Pasco rivers in Cape York. They're unable to cross the rivers that have turned into rapids. Help has been at hand though. A local chopper pilot evacuated a pregnant woman, children and some elderly locals and dropped off food as the remaining people wait for the rivers to recede.
That's what's caught people out. You know, they're travelling up and it was reasonably dry and they were able to access some of these places, and then but once we start getting this rain, because everything is wet, it doesn't take much to bring those rivers up.
From the Daintree to the Cape, the region has seen heavy falls since Easter. About 40 tonnes of fodder has arrived on the New South Wales north coast to help flood-affected farmers. 38 trucks filled with bales rolled into Casino as part of the Need to Feed initiative. The convoy had been travelling for the past few days, with some drivers coming from Tasmania and Victoria. It's the group's 8th trip to the North Coast region since February, when the floods began.
Also carrying dog food, food hampers, personal care packs, kids' toys, vet supplies. And tonight we're inviting in some of the farmers who were delivered to already to come and have dinner and drinks with us.
We'll be probably coming back for a while to help these farmers get on their feet, because it's going to take a fair bit when you've lost everything and you're starting from scratch.
Volunteers will be distributing the supplies to around 100 properties. South Australian MPs are set to launch a new bid to decriminalise sex work when Parliament resumes. The Greens will introduce a bill to legalise the practice, hoping the new mix of MPs will vote differently to past parliaments. There have been 14 previous attempts at such legislation.
I would hope that we've got 4 years ahead of us, we've got a stable government, we've had this debate many times and we know where the sticking points are. I'm hoping that we can reach some compromises and have a consensus view going forward.
Both South Australia's Premier and Opposition Leader have indicated that they'll decide their votes based on the laws that are put forward. Well, it's just 2 weeks since last refugees were released from Melbourne's notorious Park Hotel after nearly a decade in detention. While their long-term future remains uncertain, there was a brief respite from the worry with a game of cricket.
Abi Abnan once dreamed of playing elite cricket. Instead of taking his place on the pitch, he spent 9 years in immigration detention.
21, when I stepped foot on Australian soil and on Christmas Island.
He was eventually moved to Australia under Medivac laws, ending up at the Park Hotel. Today, he's spearheaded a cricket match with refugees and their supporters.
This is like sort of my dream to, when I get released alongside with other friends from detention, so then we can have like a cricket match.
We're hoping that people who love and play cricket here will come to the match, and we'll get to meet some of the refugees and see that they're ordinary people who love playing sport just like them.
He was joined by other recently released Medivac refugees.
My friend, he just invited me just to come and just play cricket. I'm not a good cricket player, to be honest, but just come and just have fun and enjoy.
A run in the autumn sun is a far cry from the months they spent locked inside the Park Hotel.
To be honest, like in Park Hotel, it was like, it was really terrible, but outside life is really beautiful.
The final group of Medivac detainees, including Abi Abnan, was released a fortnight ago.
We still having a strange feeling about that. We could not believe that we are free.
Many of the refugees from the Park Hotel grew up playing cricket, so the skill level here is pretty good. Today's match is as much a celebration of their release from detention as it is an effort to draw attention to their continuing plight.
Still our life is in limbo, we don't know about our future.
The men are now on a mixture of bridging visas and community detention visas while they wait for a resettlement place in another country.
Both major political parties have reconfirmed their commitment to Operation Sovereign Borders, which means anyone who came by boat after 2013 will never be resettled in Australia.
With limited support and no certainty about where they'll end up, a game of cricket provides a rare escape from the worry. Nicole Asher, ABC News, Melbourne.
Let's take a quick look at the weather in the capital cities for Monday. A shower or two for Brisbane, rain in Sydney, morning fog for Canberra, mostly sunny in Melbourne, becoming cloudy for you in Hobart. A mostly clear day for Adelaide, late showers expected in Perth, and a sunny day for Darwin with a top of 34. And that's the latest from ABC News. Remember, you can keep up to date with us at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. I'm Mariam Saab. Thank you for watching.
We're on the road in Gladstone this morning as the election contest shifts gear. Scare campaigns and slip-ups make way for a serious foreign policy challenge, a Chinese military presence on Australia's doorstep. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. We're on the lands of the Baeli, Gurang, Garingaring, Tarrabalang Bunda people, and we're in the federal electorate of Flynn in central Queensland, a resource-rich energy hub facing the prospect of big change on the pathway to net zero emissions. Coming up, we're going to hear the views, the priorities of people here in this election contest. It is a fascinating part of the country and a seat being fiercely contested. As for the national campaign, well, Anthony Albanese had a better week, edging out Scott Morrison in their first debate and showing a bit more confidence as a result before being struck down by COVID. The Labor leader is now in isolation. His colleagues are picking up the slack. The Prime Minister is showing him none. The week was dominated by a worrying security development on Australia's doorstep, the Solomon Islands signing a security agreement with China.
Well, as week 2 of the election campaign begins, nothing's off limits for the mischief. Boats, borders, carbon tax, mining tax, Medicare, pensioners and power prices. And that's just in the first 9 days.
Labor have learned nothing when it comes to border protection.
My opponent is running on fear and scare.
Medicare is not safe under Scott Morrison.
After a steady start, today Scott Morrison suffered his own campaign misstep, messing up the details of the dole.
How about that? Yeah! Which we increased from $40 a week to $46 a week.
Love you so much!
Later clarifying it's $46 a day.
Oh, I misspoke. It was pretty straightforward. The helm is no place for the inexperienced.
No.
A clear and present danger is emerging on our doorstep tonight after the Solomon Islands signed a security pact with China.
That we entered into an arrangement with China with our eyes wide open.
Well, this is the worst foreign policy blunder in the Pacific that Australia has seen since the end of World War II.
We don't particularly want another version of a little Cuba off our coast.
Okay. There's no need to yell.
Feeling the heat.
So why don't we all just take the temperature down?
The Prime Minister forced onto the back foot with the Solomons injecting foreign policy into the domestic fight.
Is it a failure of your Pacific Step Up program?
No, I think, no.
Australia needs to do more than step up with a slogan in the Pacific.
But what I don't understand is that when something of this significance takes place, why would you take China's side?
That's an outrageous slur from the Prime Minister.
He hasn't had the intelligence briefings. He's out there trying to make a political point, fair enough.
The coalition always wanted a national security fight during this election.
Oh, they are sharp, aren't they?
But the Solomon Islands deal does raise serious questions about the government's handling of the affair.
Good on you.
Scott Morrison has been slammed
after this answer to a mother of an autistic boy.
Jenny and I have been blessed. We've got 2 children that haven't had to go through that.
Interpreted by some as insensitive to the many parents of children with a disability.
From Labor's Katie Gallagher.
As the parent of a wonderful daughter with autism, I was really upset by that comment.
I think every child is a blessing for parents.
I meant no offence by what I said last night, but I accept that it has caused offence.
There's been an unexpected but not entirely unpredictable development in the federal election campaign.
Yes, Anthony Albanese has tested positive to COVID, which means Labor's campaign has completely changed.
We've been planning for this kind of scenario for a long time. It was always something that might happen. It could happen to either side.
I wish him a speedy recovery and hopefully the symptoms aren't too bad.
I'm just taking the health advice. I will be isolating for 7 days.
I've told him, rest up, mate.
rest up. This is a long campaign, remember.
We'll get through it. This is Australia and indeed the world in 2022, unfortunately.
And a reminder, the program's running for 90 minutes during the campaign. My first guest this morning is the Shadow Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, and later I'll be joined by the Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce, here in Gladstone. First, let's check what's making news. No new tax vow. News Corp papers report the Prime Minister will make an ironclad guarantee the coalition won't raise taxes in the next term of Parliament if re-elected. He's challenging Labor to do the same. PM resists call to Solomon's leadership. The Nine newspapers report Scott Morrison has only spoken to Prime Minister Sogavare once in the past month, and not in the days leading up to the signing of the security pact with China. That's despite a top-level US delegation visiting Honiara. And finally, in News Corp papers, Defence Minister Peter Dutton says he won't be cowed by China and has stepped up his rhetoric. He says the strategic circumstances facing Australia are as dire as they were in the 1930s. Well, it's been instructive spending most of the week here in Gladstone, I must say, listening to concerns about the great energy transition facing Australia and what it means for workers right here. The other concern that has come up a lot, as it does elsewhere, is China. Beijing's security agreement with the Solomon Islands is a game changer and a serious setback for Australia. It challenges the Prime Minister's claim to be the superior manager of national security, and it does raise important questions about how the two major parties plan to manage relations in the Pacific. Let's bring in our panel. I'm joined here in Gladstone by Patricia Karvelis, David Crowe, and for the first time on Insiders, Claire Armstrong. Great to have you here. Not quite on the Insiders couch, but a stool here at the Gladstone Yacht Club. Lovely to be here with all of you. Let's start on the Solomons. David, perhaps it is worth just explaining what the security agreement does potentially mean for Australia. Indeed, if it does result in the military base, a Chinese military base, how serious is that?
It's incredibly serious, and I think you've just mentioned what Peter Dutton said about returning to the 30s, and there is that element of concern about Australian security now in our own region, in the southwest Pacific. Now, it's not an agreement to set up a military base because, of course, the Solomons Prime Minister is insisting that that's not his intention. But every time China has done this around the world, agreements have led to swift development of bases, and so that's the scenario that Australia is looking at. We're 2,000 kilometres from our coast. We've got an island in the southwest Pacific that will be hosting Chinese aircraft, Chinese naval vessels, and having Chinese personnel based there to support those operations. Now, that could mean anything from surveillance to any hypothetical exertion of power in our region. And that's why when you talk to security experts, they're quite openly saying that the scenario is that our defence planners now must have a response to this.
And these are important questions too, I think, for both sides of politics as to how they deal with this, how they prevent further bases or agreements in the Pacific with other neighbouring countries. But in the white heat of an election contest, PK, immediately the debate's gone to, well, how on earth did this happen? Could more have been done to stop it happening?
That is the central question in this election campaign, and Labor has sought to put it at the centre of the election campaign. It inserted itself there because of the timing, let's be honest. So no one could have avoided, the fact that it happened now. We have to respond to things as they happen. But Labor then sought to elevate the issue.
Let me show you. Penny Wong, here she was during the week, absolutely laying the blame for this defeat of the Morrison government.
This is the worst foreign policy blunder in the Pacific that Australia has seen since the end of World War II. It is going to make our region less secure, and this has all happened on Scott Morrison's watch.
Yeah, PK, is that fair criticism?
It is fair to hold the government to account for what it's done while it's been in power to avoid this scenario, absolutely. They're in power, and they've also been incredibly muscular about China and the rhetoric on China, and it's come perhaps back to bite them on the bottom, if I can be really clear about what I think. So you can't escalate a debate like that, like they have in the Parliament, Manchurian candidate kind of language, extreme language, which we know our national security chiefs have told us shouldn't be used, and I think is really dangerous to use, can I say, in an election campaign in a contested space. But the question now is, did the Morrison government do enough to avoid this? If you look at the evidence, just some of the things that Labor's been raising, one of the issues is why wasn't Marise Payne, who's the foreign minister, why wasn't she dispatched to the Solomons? Why was Zed Seselja, lovely man, I don't mean to be rude about Zed Seselja.
But he is the more junior
He's
Pacific
quite junior.
minister. Yeah.
Now, he was sent during the election campaign. I spoke to Simon Birmingham, who's the coalition spokesperson, the other day, and I said, Julie Bishop, who was a very successful foreign minister for the Conservative side of politics up until recently, she thinks that Marise Payne should be sent on the next plane. He said, no, we're not going to send her till after the election, potentially. It won't happen during the election campaign. I don't know why not. We're having this debate during the election about it.
Let me show you some other responses from the government on this. There are, I guess, been two main responses. One has been that they've been taking the advice of those intelligence chiefs as to how to handle this. But the other, the Prime Minister essentially arguing it was too late to stop the deal being done.
They had made their decision. And so the Foreign Minister was not the right person to send at that time. We communicated a very clear message to the Prime Minister through the Minister for Pacific. No one was going to convince anybody at that point. They had made their decision.
I mean, Claire, none of us are, intelligence security experts per se, but is it obvious that sending the Foreign Minister would have shown more seriousness here, more concern from Australia?
It would have shown more serious from Australia's point of view, but I think the issue is, and Morrison did canvass this at one point in the week, that the Pacific nations are quite vocal about not wanting to have larger powers in the region like Australia come in and effectively strong-arm them in not a dissimilar way to what we're obviously thinking that China is doing, and that sometimes that softly approach is the better way diplomatically. I think, though, broadly, you look at, the government will argue that the US has obviously sent a pretty high-level delegation, but they haven't sent, the Secretary of State. They've sent Kurt Campbell, who is sort of, I guess, on par with Zed Seselja within the US system. New Zealand haven't sent their foreign minister. Japan is sending a junior minister. So Australia would be looking at that and sort of coordinating with their allies. Like, make no mistake about all of those conversations going on behind the scenes. So to think that it may or may not have made a difference, obviously the government say not, but they invited this political debate to their door when they went on the attack.
Exactly, and that's PK's point. Kurt Campbell, I should know though, he's been a heavy hitter in the region for a couple of decades, really. He's Mr. Pacific under both the Obama and now the Biden administration.
I don't think you have to say that Marise Payne could have stopped the deal happening. No. I mean, this has been happening for several years now. The Solomons recognised China, not Taiwan, in 2019. In fact, a lot of the timeline is concurrent with the timeline of Scott Morrison's government, because he went to Solomon Islands in June of 2019.
It was the first place he went.
And then later that same year, the change in recognition towards Beijing happened. So this has been several years in the making.
There's nothing new about it.
And Marise Payne might not have been able to stop it, but I think they are judged on whether they could have made every possible attempt.
Well, there's also this argument about whether we should be spending or should have been spending more on aid in the Solomons and the Pacific as well, and whether that would have stopped this happening. A lot of figures and counter arguments around this. I just want to show you this charts from the ANU's Crawford School of Public Policy, and it really demonstrates. You can see it goes back to the 60s, and over decades, what's happened with defence spending. That's the one going up and up and up. And aid spending, which has remained flat as a pancake. And
it was the Abbott government that gutted aid spending. Yeah. And so when we talk about what more could have been done, I'm not trying to focus on some kind of one visit, that amazing visit. Oh, Marise Payne's here, we're just going to tear that up. Obviously not. But this government has been in power for close to a decade, and ultimately what happens in that decade, they're responsible for. That is the point of government. And they gutted aid funding.
The aid money for Solomon Islands is lower now than it was in that period before 2014. So there's no question about the impact of that. But it's not just about aid, it's about a lot of other things.
Well, is it also about other things like bribes?
Well, I think the unspoken thing here is there is an inherent distrust on the Australian side of the Solomons government. Morrison and Dutton both came very close to alluding to China being able to negotiate with some levers that Australia would never be able to pull.
Let me just pause there, because we've got a bit of it here, as you say, alluding to it, not being very subtle about what they're suggesting.
I'll make this point. China conducts their business in a very different way than we do. There are, you asked a question about bribery or corruption. We don't pay off, we don't bribe people. The Chinese certainly do, and they've demonstrated that in Africa and elsewhere. And people can draw their own conclusions.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether bribes were paid, but Peter Dutton's certainly leaving that impression, right?
Well, I think what's interesting is you look at what Australia did a few years ago, where we stepped in to ensure that Huawei and China weren't the telecoms provider for the Solomons. That was a legitimate tender that we could bid for and that we could do all above board. That is clearly not the case in a deal like this. There's no fair playing ground for us to compete on. And more than that, I think it's worth noting, my understanding is that this government for a long time has been concerned about the way that their conversations with the Prime Minister are being relayed to his own party, to his colleagues. A lot of it in the last few years and months has shifted to in writing. There are many degrees of concerns about what that channel of communication looks like anyway.
And if that's the case, and if this suggestion, this inference that bribes are involved, what can Australia do?
Well, this is the key question, and I suppose I here defer to the security experts. They say there is actually quite a lot Australia can still do, that if we're going to lay down and say, oh, well, we can't pay the bribes, and make our country vulnerable, that's just not an acceptable response, is it? So we say that we still want to be, and our intention is to be the partner of choice. Let's just consider how long we've been in the Solomons. What is it, nearly 2 decades? In terms of our presence there.
Going back to the Ramsey.
Yeah, that's right. We've had a key role here for a very long time. This is not something that's not salvageable. This deal is not something that is a fait accompli either. And in fact, that's the key question on this election campaign now that this is front and centre. What are both sides of politics going to do to try to avoid this spreading in the Pacific, but also mitigate, dealing with it, actually, ring fencing this thing, because it does make us less safe.
What about Richard Marles, Labor's deputy leader, and the things that he has said in the past and not so distant past about China's role in the region and about what Australia can do to stop that?
I honestly think that is being blown out of proportion, just totally blown out of proportion. If you go back and look at this government, taking PK's point about 9 years in power, they had a defence agreement with China in 2014. That's not so long ago. When Scott Morrison was in Solomon Islands in June of 2019, he was asked about China's role, and he was very guarded about China. He wasn't criticising China for being in the region. There always is this school of thought that as a rising power, China will have growing influence around the world, including in our region, and that is something that we have to accept and deal with. I think on both sides of politics, they've been very careful not to be belligerent about China when it's active in the region. Now, I don't think that their rhetoric means that they just blithely accept that China can do a deal with somewhere like the Solomon Islands. There's a mix of what they say in public and what they say in private, and I think that's always the way, and I think that some of those comments by Richard Marles should be seen in that context.
Yeah, what do you think, Lee?
I think it's about the difference between being alive to the issue rather than welcoming it, and that was the point that he made to defend it. And I think Jason Clare as well was asked about it on Friday. I think he quoted back a sort of pro-China line that Morrison had said a few years ago, that you can't escape the fact that this is the way that they are operating. They're interested in the region, so you have to be realistic about that without necessarily encouraging or supportive of it.
And it's difficult. You can't say to a sovereign country, you cannot deal with China.
Exactly, and they don't say that. No. Scott Morrison didn't say that in June 2019 when he was in Solomon Islands.
Yeah. I think that line, though, from Richard Marles, who was questioned in that story and then was questioned about giving his speech to the Chinese embassy before delivering it, for instance, I think the fact that he didn't change his speech is... I don't think the politicians should be giving their speeches.
Well, he makes the point, right? No one in the coalition has had the guts to go and give a speech on Chinese soil over the years, criticising China over what they've done in Hong Kong and the Uyghurs, and so he did. Now, yes, he showed it to them as a courtesy, is what he's saying here. But boy, the government's absolutely turning the heat on him over what he's...
And there's a reason for that, right? They're under genuine pressure here on the Solomons-China deal because they are in government and there are genuine and legitimate questions about what they've been doing to try and avoid this scenario, which makes us less safe. And at the same time, while this is playing out, after the last couple of years where I think they've used much more muscular language about China, the government can't believe that this is turning on them, right? Because they're like, we're the tough guys on China.
You saw in the paper this morning, I think Dutton gave an interview where he again branded Penny Wong as the appeaser, and that's very deliberate language on his part. He's used it a number of times. The Prime Minister tried to characterise Albanese as being on China's side during the leaders' debate earlier in the week. Coincidentally, one of the only times there was an audible groan from the audience.
Is that right in the room? You were there,
just very good ears on television.
So the audience is the point. The audience didn't like that stuff.
They're aware that this, I think even the government became aware in that week where the Manchurian candidate issue came up in question time. They sort of had realised they'd jumped the shark a little there, and I think that the scrutiny they are under now is large in part due to their politicisation of China in the last 6 months.
We don't quite know how it's going to play out because we haven't had an election campaign where an outside event like this has happened and has brought such drama to the campaign itself. And I think there's an element where the coalition may feel they're still campaigning on their issue. With a conservative
some of them are happy to be
still believing they're the best side.
I think that's 100% right.
And so we don't quite know how that's going to play out as this external impact on the campaign.
And that's why
when we don't have a major big policy contest from either side, right?
I just want to say, I think, but that's why Labor making this decision to go in hard on this is actually. It is a risky move, but I think on balance they've made the right decision because I do think there are questions that they have to raise with the government on this, and to insinuate, as some have been doing, that they are appeasers, I do believe jumps the shark. I love that term because it's and I think it's dangerous to create this idea that we've got this big contest on foreign affairs. I'm uncomfortable with it in an election campaign. I think China should look to us and see a unified country, not that this kind of politics is being played, because they will exploit it.
Yeah, all right. Well, time to bring in my first guest this morning, the Shadow Treasurer and Labor's most senior figure in Queensland, Jim Chalmers, joining us from Brisbane. Welcome to the program.
Looks like a great morning in a terrific Queensland town of Gladstone. I'm very envious.
It is a terrific Queensland town. I will not argue with that at all. Look, let's start on the Solomon Islands. Labor has argued that this is the greatest foreign policy failure in the Pacific since World War II, what's happened here. How exactly could it have been avoided?
Well, David, for all the government's chest beating about China, the net result of that is a region which is less secure and a nation which is less safe. And clearly, this is the consequence of a government which has cut foreign aid spending. They've mocked our Pacific friends when it comes to climate change, and they've dropped the ball when it comes to our national security, and that's what we're seeing now. Our country is less safe as a consequence of the mistakes that they've made on foreign policy. That is the net effect and the consequence of all of this chest beating. Now, this is a Prime Minister that went to the wrong island. Went to Hawaii during the bushfires when his focus should have been on the Solomon Islands. The fact that they have failed so substantially here is a direct risk to our national security. The Chinese are setting up a military base on our doorstep, and the government needs to take responsibility for that rather than try and blame everyone else.
All right, well, a couple of things. Firstly, Prime Minister Sogavare says, no, they're not setting up a military base. So you don't believe him on that?
Well, the final text of the agreement is not yet available, and as your introduction rightly pointed out, there is the prospect here of basing Chinese military assets in the Solomon Islands. Let's see what the final agreement says. But it's not contested amongst anybody who knows this issue that this failure, it is the biggest foreign policy failure in the Pacific since the Second World War. It has made Australia less safe and less secure, despite all of the chest beating from Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton.
You mentioned foreign aid and climate change. So are you suggesting that if we'd spent more on foreign aid, done more on climate change, that the Solomons would not have signed this agreement they'd clearly been working towards?
I'm saying that we need to earn the trust and we need to earn the friendship of our Pacific neighbours. And we need to rebuild our diplomatic capacity. Part of that relies on being credible partners on climate change, and part of that relies on being meaningful partners when it comes to development assistance. I don't think it's contested that the government has dropped the ball on both of those areas, in addition to the mistakes they've made when it comes to getting defence investments away. And all of these things together have meant that our national security has been undermined by this government. The consequence of their mistakes is a nation which is less safe and a region which is less secure.
All right, well, let's talk about what you would do. If elected in 4 weeks' time, what would Labor do to make us more safe on this front?
Well, we need to rebuild those relationships. We rebuild those relationships
what does that mean?
by being a credible partner on climate change, having a credible climate change policy, and we do. It means investing in development assistance, in foreign aid, and we'll have more to say about that. So you boost foreign aid? We'll have more to say about that during the course of the election, as Penny Wong has made clear. That's an important part of the story, but it's not the whole story. How we manage our defence investments, how we be a credible partner on climate, and how we manage our foreign aid responsibilities, all of these things together
more on foreign
are
aid
important
and
more of the puzzle.
More on the Foreign Affairs Department as well. You did mention diplomacy. Will you boost spending there?
We'll have more to say about this, David, via Penny Wong at the appropriate time during the election campaign. But we need to rebuild our diplomatic capacity, particularly amongst our near neighbours. That much is clear. And foreign aid will be part of it. Being a credible partner on climate is part of it, and in other ways as well.
All right, we'll stand by for those more to come announcements. The Prime Minister today is making what he's calling an ironclad guarantee that he won't raise taxes in the next term of Parliament. Can you do the same?
Well, first of all, David, you can't believe a word that Scott Morrison says about the economy, and especially about tax. This is the second highest taxing government of the last 30 years. The highest taxing government was John Howard's on every available measure, whether it's total tax, tax as a proportion of the economy, tax per person, tax adjusted for inflation.
Let's try and stick to your plans if we can then, Jim Chalmers.
Than the last Labor government
Let's talk about Labor.
Yep.
OK, let's talk about Labor. Can you give that guarantee?
Well, we have said that we are not proposing any tax reforms beyond the proposals that we will shortly make about multinational tax reform. Now, the Prime Minister today, in making this commitment, appears to be walking away from a deal that Australia said that they want to be part of. 130 countries around the world who recognise that we need a fairer way to tax multinationals so they're paying their fair share in the countries where they make their profits. When the Prime Minister stands up later today, he needs to make it clear, is he sticking with this commitment that he's made by press release this morning, or is he sticking to the commitment that he made to 130 other countries that Australia would take meaningful steps on multinational tax reform? We've said that we want to be part of that conversation.
Your plans then, so your plans on multinational tax, I mean, there are a lot of multinationals that are big employers in this town where we are, Rio Tinto, Shell, Anglo Coal, Peabody Energy and so on. Will they pay more tax under Labor?
Well, most of the global developments on multinational tax reform are focused on the changes in the digital economy. But what we will be proposing and making clear before election day is not targeting one sector of the economy or another. Clearly...
Sure, but will the big employers here have to pay more tax?
Well, to the extent that some of them are multinationals, obviously multinational tax reform impacts multinational corporations. But what we will be pointing out... Well, what we'll be pointing out is that our proposals aren't directed overwhelmingly at one sector or another. It's a broad plan which adopts the global principles that the government says that they have adopted as well. Part of that...
what does that mean, though, for these employers here? How much more tax will they have to pay?
Well, we'll make that clear when we make our announcement, David, but what I'm trying to say is that there are global developments at the OECD level. The OECD, led by Matthias Cormann, has made proposals around digital tax reform. They've made proposals about how businesses account for their profits. There are OECD principles when it comes to how debt is accounted for so that multinationals pay their fair share of tax. There's a whole agenda around transparency, and there's an agenda around tax havens and intellectual property. Now, the whole world is moving in this direction, and Australia should be part of it. Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg have previously said that they want to be part of it.
All right,
he needs to make clear today whether he's ditching that commitment.
OK. I just want to stick to Labor's plans here if we can. On top of that, multinational tax changes. You've got your safeguards mechanism changes under your climate plans, and you and Richard Miles were asked about this yesterday. So can you explain what that means? The 215 companies who will face tighter safeguards mechanisms under your plans, what does that mean for the employers here in the energy sector?
Well, you're right that there are 215 entities which will be subject to the safeguard mechanism. That's as it is right now. Their obligations will be determined by the Clean Energy Regulator, who factors in things like international competition and the technological possibilities that each entity has. So each of those 215 entities will have their obligations determined by the Clean Energy Regulator. As we said yesterday when we were asked, the best outcome from our point of view is that entities reduce their emissions in line with their obligations. Something like two out of every 3 of those 215 entities have already got emissions reduction plans consistent with net zero by 2050.
If they don't meet that target, what happens? Do they have to pay?
Well, they have two options. They can reduce their emissions, which is our preference, or they can buy carbon credits. That has been clear in our policy. It's also clear in the government's policy since the beginning.
So what will that cost the employers here under your plans?
Well, the assumptions in our modelling are identical to the assumptions in the government's policy, which is that the current cost of carbon abatement is something like $24 a tonne. But again, that's not the only option for businesses and entities trying to reduce their emissions. There are technological possibilities as well. Our preference is that they reduce their emissions in line with the obligations determined by the Clean Energy Regulator. That's the point that we made clear yesterday.
But you're tightening those obligations is the point. OK. Look, we're also focused a bit on here, while we've been here, on what comes next, right, as we move on this pathway to net zero emissions. There's a lot of talk about a green energy, hydrogen future for this part of Queensland. People want to see the plans, though. What are Labor's plans to help that transition along and help the workers here?
Well, I'm absolutely convinced that cities like Gladstone and right around regional Queensland can be the powerhouses of the modern Australian economy. I think the future is brighter than the past when it comes to places like Gladstone. I've made 64 visits to 29 different regional Queensland towns this term alone. 29 visits to 12 mining towns and 5 visits to Gladstone itself. And
that's
after
a lot. So what's your plan?
All of that consultation, I am convinced that regional Queensland can be a bigger part of the story as the national economy recovers. And the reason why I'm convinced about that is we are the only party in this election with a modelled jobs policy for regional Queensland. And in our modelling for our Powering Australia plan, 604,000 new jobs created. 5 out of 6 of those are in the regions. And the reason that Gladstone and towns like it around regional Queensland can be such a big part of the story of our economic success into the future is because they've got so much of what we need. You know, I've already been in Gladstone during the course.
So what will you do? What will your plan? If we can just get an idea of what your plan means. Are you going to invest in hydrogen power here?
Yeah, we've made that clear. Our plans for cleaner and cheaper energy, whether it's the Powering the Regions Fund, whether it's the National Reconstruction Fund, there are exciting possibilities in hydrogen.
Does it mean you're underwriting or investing in, or how does it work for building new hydrogen here?
Yep, we've made that clear already, that our National Reconstruction Fund will make something like $3 billion available to the sorts of industries that Gladstone will be really successful into the future. Gladstone's got all the ingredients that make our plan work. You know, deep water port, lots of skills, heavy industry, the possibilities for manufacturing. I was there already during the course of the election campaign with the state government of Queensland making big investments in hydrogen and ammonia in particular. You've got all the possibilities of battery manufacturing, all of the investments made by Twiggy Forrest and others. It is a really exciting place. And my fear is that the government sees places like Gladstone as a source of votes, but not as a source of jobs and opportunities.
Let's stick to Labor if we can here. OK, we get the sledges on the other side. Coal. We heard Anthony Albanese this week when asked about the prospect of new coal mines in Queensland say, look, as long as the approvals stack up, the finances stack up, no problem. How do you achieve net zero emissions if new coal mines are being opened?
Well, first of all, the point that Anthony makes is entirely right and just the common sense approach to take. If it stacks up environmentally and if it stacks up commercially, it will go ahead. But the market at the end of the day will determine that. What we've shown in our modelling...
Well, the market doesn't have... the market doesn't have to determine whether you achieve net zero emissions. You would. So how does it fit with achieving net zero emissions?
Because the modelling of our safeguard mechanism and all of our associated climate change policies makes it clear we can get to net zero by mid-century, we can get to 43% by 2030.
With new coal mines?
Well, our modelling assumes the same as the government's modelling when it comes to new coal mines. And what we've said about that very clearly is that that will be determined in the appropriate way across multiple levels of government. But what our modelling shows, the most detailed modelling that anyone's put out from opposition when it comes to climate change, is the combination of our safeguard mechanism that we spoke about already and all of our associated policies will get our emissions down. Most importantly, it will mean cleaner and cheaper energy, more investment, particularly in the regions, and more jobs, particularly in the regions.
All right, but does your modelling allow for new coal mines?
Our modelling assumes the same as the government when it comes to new coal mines.
Which is what?
Our expectation is what? Our expectation is that any new proposals will be evaluated in the usual way. That's what our modelling accounts for. Now, we have said repeatedly that there is a future for coal for the time being because there is an appetite for coal around the world. But over time, our energy mix will change. That's what our modelling makes clear.
OK, look, we've heard from you this morning that there will be further announcements on things like foreign aid, on the diplomatic service. There'll be further announcements, we know, on health as well. We still don't know whether Labor's going to spend more on hospitals and schools, as you have in previous elections promised to do. We do have a structural deficit, though, in the budget, stretching for the next decade. And I know you've said later in the year, if you're Treasurer, you'll hand down a new budget for this year. Will that have to include some spending cut?
Oh, we've made it clear, David, that we do need to trim spending in areas like the Commonwealth spending on consultants and contractors and labour hire. We think that there are substantial savings to be made there. We would be inheriting, if we're successful on the 21st of May, $1 trillion in debt and not enough to show for it. And that means we need to come at this challenge from a variety of different perspectives. First of all, we need to reorient the budget towards quality spending. We need to invest in the drivers of growth, and that's what our 5-point economic plan will do. But we also need to trim spending where the wasteful spending has been the most egregious. And we also need to look at multinational tax reform, as we discussed earlier. This budget is the worst budget that any government has ever taken to an election, the most wasteful government since Federation. And so we take that challenge seriously.
We've heard your points about the other side. Look, finally, Anthony Albanese, he's on day 3 of COVID isolation. Is his absence helping or hurting the campaign for Labor?
Oh, we'd rather have him on the park, David, obviously, but the pandemic has taught us to prepare for every eventuality, and that's what we've done. It does give us the opportunity to showcase our team. You know, one of the things about Anthony, which we all appreciate, and I think the Australian people will appreciate, as he puts a lot of effort into building up his team. That's a key element of his leadership. Leadership is also about dealing with adversity and playing the cards that you're dealt, and that's what we're doing right now. But most importantly, when it comes to leadership, it's about being there for people. It's about taking responsibility. It's about working hard every day to bring people together. You can't say any of those things about Scott Morrison.
And for you and your other senior colleagues who are stepping up to fill the void, it is, I guess, a potential test, isn't it, for who should be, could be the next leader?
Oh, we don't see it that way. We want the next Prime Minister of Australia to be Anthony Albanese. We're working our butts off to make that a reality.
Jim Chalmers, Shadow Treasurer, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, David.
Well, they don't see it that way, as a bit of a test for the rest as to who might replace, one day, Anthony Albanese. But Claire, is it?
I mean, how can it not be? You've got a platform where, for once, a lot more Australians are really focusing on what is happening in federal politics, and the leader is unable to fill that void.
And how are the rest of them going?
I think there was a lot of chatter around Jason Clare's tilt. Obviously, he's campaign spokesman for Labor, but he seemed to get all the nightly news grabs on Friday, a few good quips. And I think now that you've seen yesterday with Jim and also Richard Miles jumping into the spotlight, there seems to be quite a conscious effort to not necessarily let one raise their head above the parapet more than the others, whether that's an agreement among themselves or a desire of the leadership.
So because Jason did well, you reckon, just dial it back a bit and put someone else in?
They'll argue that it was always the plan to rotate.
What's going on, do you think, David? How are they handling it?
I think they're handling it as best they can. I thought it was going to work positively for Anthony Albanese at first. When
What, being benched for a week?
Yeah, well, in the sense that I thought that they could adapt with a different campaign while he's in isolation. You can still do a lot of electronic media from isolation. But then on his first day, on that Friday, and I'm told that his health was still okay, he didn't do a lot of radio interviews, and then he did ABC TV in the afternoon, on a Friday afternoon.
Well, he did the rounds of TVs, but I understand he's not going to do much more of that.
Well, look, the health conditions may not allow that. I mean, COVID affects people in different ways. The point that I was just trying to get at is, I thought initially it might work positively for them. Now I think, as the days go by, it's going to be negative for their campaign, and I think that's just the impact here.
Well, there's a couple of ways of looking at it, right?
Here, sorry, when you talk to people here, they still want to hear from the leader. I know it's good to have the team out there, but ultimately in these campaigns it does come down to the leader. And if he's not as visible,
this is one of his challenges.
Talk to the people here. They need to find out more about who Anthony Albanese is.
The flip side, PK, is that Labor, we know, have wanted the focus to be on Scott Morrison and the negatives around the Prime Minister, and at least this does force a lot more focus on the PM.
So yesterday Scott Morrison didn't do a media conference. Can we talk about how unusual that is? Really unusual. I think he needed to actually be subjected to some serious scrutiny, particularly around this Solomon's China deal yesterday, yet he wasn't. He didn't take questions. He sent out the campaign spokesperson, Simon Birmingham, who did a decent job in Brisbane, as he did. But it's pretty strange for the Prime Minister not to be taking questions. But I think the fact that Albanese is in isolation is the kind of way that they can try and defend that, which is, oh, well, their leader's not taking questions. Even though you'll notice, when it first happened and it was all revealed, they were very clear about, we're not going to hold back, we're going to campaign like normal. And they pointed out that when Scott Morrison had COVID, that Anthony Albanese was touring flood zones, and he was certainly right in the middle of it and capitalising on the opportunity.
Well, Claire, you're amongst us. You're the one who's been on the campaign trail following the leaders around. What does this mean for the Labor campaign plan?
Well, I'm reliably informed they've got up quite early this morning. I think they're going to Darwin. But the plan has obviously dramatically changed.
This is the PM you're talking about?
This is Labor. So Labor bus. Yes. But obviously Anthony Albanese planned to be in Perth on the back half of this week. That didn't happen. They ended up staying in Sydney next day. So it's definitely been a quick kind of scramble, redraw, bringing forward of certain things to suit sort of the shadow that's going to be leading the tour. Whether it has dramatically impacted Morrison's route is harder to say. I mean, it is the Anzac long weekend. I think it's important to acknowledge that this was always a bit of a quieter weekend. It is pretty astonishing that the Prime Minister didn't have a press conference yesterday, and I was there when Anthony Albanese cut his short to about 8 minutes and didn't pass the pub test. And I don't think not standing up at all obviously is no better. In fact, it's worse. So,
but it is important to note a few differences in this campaign. The last election campaign was premised entirely around the Prime Minister. He was a kind of clean skin in the electorate in many ways. He'd been the Treasurer. We knew him very well, but I think He really cultivated an image. Now he's got a record. Some would say a record that Labor's trying to, really capitalise on his unpopularity in the electorate. And you'll see that he's also flanked by ministers a whole lot more.
And there are some parts where he's deploying Josh Frydenberg and the Prime Minister won't go.
Well, the Prime Minister can't go to North Sydney. He can't go to Wentworth.
Casey Briggs is going to have a bit more on that for us
because it's a really big problem.
The two leaders did both appear, though, at the first leaders' debate, the Sky News People's Forum during the week. I want to get your thoughts on some of that. I'll set it up here. I thought they both did reasonably well. Anthony Albanese had the edge, and certainly the room. What was it? 40% of the undecided voters gave it to Albanese, 35% to Morrison, and still a lot who were unimpressed or undecided. But a couple of stumbles. The Prime Minister was asked from one woman about her the NDIS support package for her child with autism. The Prime Minister's response was, well, Jenny and I are blessed that our two kids don't face those challenges. He did apologise the next day.
But I can appreciate, particularly with some of the ways it was communicated and the way it was sought to be represented by our political opponents in the middle of an election, that it could have been taken in a different context. And I'm deeply sorry about that.
So, an apology, but a bit of blame for Labor.
After Dylan Alcott tweeted.
Yeah, the Australian of the year.
And there's one dude who's really popular in this country, that's Dylan Alcott.
And I don't know if we've still got an answer as to why NDIS recipients, and she's not the only one, suddenly have these packages reduced, and the impact that has.
I thought that was the really key thing out of that element of the debate. The next day, Catherine, the mother, talking about Ethan, her son, who needs NDIS help, wasn't getting the help that she believed she needed, but also she didn't get the answer that she needed from the Prime Minister. So it wasn't just his use of the word blessed, it was the substance of the answer that she found to be inadequate. And I think that's the issue for the government on the NDIS when so many people rely on it now. And so that ended up being a net negative. But as for the debate itself, I thought it was reasonably evenly matched for most of that debate. And I thought it was quite interesting that Scott Morrison put it on Anthony Albanese with the question about boat turnbacks.
Well, we've got that here. So this was the stumble for Anthony Albanese. I thought a bit of confusion around what was the policy and Scott Morrison's policy before the 2013 election.
Why didn't you support turnbacks then?
You weren't proposing.
No,
you were not proposing.
I'm sorry, we were. It was our policy.
You were not
Turnbacks were our policy before the 2013 election. I was the shadow immigration minister. So you were going to do turnbacks?
No, that's right.
It absolutely was. Their policy was one of the biggest issues in that election campaign, the boat turnbacks policy.
And Labor had offshore processing in 2013. They came in with that, with Anthony Albanese as Deputy Prime Minister and Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister, but not on turnbacks. I thought that Anthony Albanese picked it up later.
See, he did. Later in the debate.
I think it's always actually an effective message for an opposition leader to say, we will learn and we don't object to that policy.
That was a great line.
I actually thought it was an excellent line to say, and when there's a good idea, we'll adopt it.
You were right, I was wrong, I agree with you now.
It wasn't even a new line. He had said that in an interview with our paper, with the Daily Telegraph about a week previous to the election being called, that when there's that is a thing I've changed my mind on. I've seen the policy in action and I think that works and we're going to keep it. It's kind of been, I think, a continuation for Albanese of this attempt to kind of co-opt legitimacy based on his past experience. He came under so much attack from the coalition in the last few months about not having had an economic portfolio, so we start hearing about his few days as an acting PM and things like that, and then all of a sudden he's gone to say, well, I'm tough on boats because in 2013 we had offshore processing, and he just took it too far.
But this is interesting on the boats. I actually think that Labor, I know Labor believes they lost that debate. They couldn't win that debate, that ultimately you have to adhere to the wishes of voters, that the view was that this was a better outcome, and they actually have moved quite dramatically
and look, let's face
in this direction.
It's not an issue in this campaign for voters that I've spoken to anywhere I've been. It is entirely
It's been confected by the coalition,
government, to put a lot of pressure on Albo.
And the silly thing as well is that Labor's policy hasn't changed at all in the last 3 weeks. Albo's
They've been messy in explaining it.
3 really bad answers on that issue, and the coalition have exploited it because they know it's
Are voters worried about about this now?
No, I don't believe it's top of mind compared to cost of living and all the other issues that are around at the moment.
Yeah.
But the other thing that struck me about the debate is that though both sides were relatively low level, I thought that Anthony Albanese had the cut-through line on the Pacific stuff-up.
Yeah.
Like, that was a good workshop line, delivered well, got through. Scott Morrison, it struck me, didn't have quite as sharp a response, and there was something about the debate that looked to me like a bit of a warm-up, because they both know that there's going to be other debates and that's going to get more willing.
Let's hope so. Look, I want to look more at what people here are worried about, interested in, what their priorities are. I mean, we talked about the asylum seeker and boats issue, but let's turn to the region that we're in. This is the seat of Flynn, which stretches from the outskirts of Rockhampton down to Bundaberg, and it takes in Emerald, but the main centre's right here in Gladstone. The Nationals' Ken O'Dowd's retiring, which means the margin of 8.7% is probably softer than it looks. Former State MP Colin Boyce is trying to hold the seat for the LNP. The Mayor of Gladstone, Matt Burnett, is trying to take it for Labor. One Nation also did well here 3 years ago, securing just under 20% of the primary vote. I spent some time talking to folks here about the issues they want addressed in this election. The future of this industrial town, a key concern. There's a lot of talk about Gladstone becoming a powerhouse for green energy and hydrogen, but some scepticism too.
The tagline for Gladstone now is hydrogen.
Twiggy's having a go at it.
I do have concerns with regards to these hydrogen hubs.
Jennifer Maguire is an independent management consultant for local industries.
The two latest biggest plants for hydrogen, we welcome them. We love industry in Gladstone. I've worked in it for 30 years. However, is that going to be at the expense of our own natural resources?
We can have up to 5 or 6.
David Thomas owns a number of small businesses, including this workshop in Gladstone.
We all know it's the future. We've got to go to green, yeah, but we've got to do it in a sustainable way so that we can keep the industry going. Because if you take out a big part of the carbon industry here, you've got a workforce, it's going to go straight to the dolphin.
Emma Smith is a high school teacher and was once a member of the Greens.
I think a lot of people know that a lot of change will come our way, but we're not really sure how that will happen and how fast it will happen.
Will Wilson runs a cattle property near Biloela. He's the chair of the Ag Force Queensland Cattle Board and also an LNP member.
We don't want 3 button pushers left at the end. We need something that can keep people going around in a sustainable type of industry.
Will hydrogen do that?
Apparently we know a lot about it, but we can't make a jerry can full of it.
John Ambrock is a technician in the oil and gas sector.
So we need to be a bit more cautious with all this talk about a future hydrogen industry.
I think some people believe that all you have to do is say it and then do it, and your way, whereas I'm like, whoa, there's a lot of testing and a lot of sort of proving of stuff that has to happen.
Matthew Cook is a Bailey man. He's the CEO of the Nullandu Health Service, the local Aboriginal medical service in Gladstone, and he's also an ALP member. He wants to make sure the community, including its Indigenous members, aren't left behind as fossil fuels are gradually replaced.
We need to see, corporate industry play a leadership role in building this town and meaningfully building this town. They take a lot out of this town. What are they doing to offset what we have to live with? And that includes for First Nation traditional owners.
What are the priorities for you, do you think?
Labour, trying to find workers to work for your businesses. You have to bring in skilled and unskilled labour.
My big concern is the Biloela Tamil family. I'd really like them to be able to come home.
They are not there to form the government.
Supriya Singh is a project officer for Strong Communities, a program which works with people from diverse backgrounds.
It's really expensive. People are struggling to find houses. The houses which are coming for rent, it's super expensive. Day-to-day stuff, people are struggling to make, to get food on the table.
It's definitely getting higher. It's getting higher to do business. It's getting higher to live. Everything is going up for sure.
What are the sort of future plans you'd like to hear more about?
In particular would be our security. They've been so busy arguing over boat people that they've dropped the ball on our foreign affairs and our security.
The China thing always concerns me, always has. I think it's something we really, really need to be on top of. We need to watch, we need to stand a bit against them. Not a bit, a lot.
Should we be spending more on defence?
Yes. Yes, definitely.
I also am concerned that we've got a lot of foreign investment, that they really don't know where it is, where it's being invested in, and I know firsthand that there are investors buying up from overseas our islands off Australia. Of course, the Port of Darwin, I felt that they were napping. So I have huge concerns over how we've handled ourselves as foreign affairs.
All right, some of the views here in Gladstone. The thing that struck me is people are engaged in the election contest here. They are paying attention. A lot of the time we shrug our shoulders and wonder whether everyone's disengaged. Here I found people are really interested in it. Claire, you've spent probably more time than the rest of us living in Queensland, Brisbane and up north. What have you picked up here in Gladstone?
Much the same. They are engaged and they are very aware that they're headed for a big change. This is a town where I think for the electorate of Flynn, I think it's like 1 in every 8 people in the electorate that either work in cattle or in mining. They are very aware of the industries that they are working in and the outside factors that affect them. And you look at somewhere like Gladstone, the bigger population centre, between the alumina refinery, the aluminium smelter, the mine, the mining and the power station, the gas on Curtis Island. These are massive employers, and the people here know that that's not going to last forever, but they look around. Twiggy Forrest has been up here. He's got a big green hydrogen facility. They're actually looking at manufacturing electrolyzers here to export for the production of hydrogen. And you can hear in
that clip there, people know that's coming and a potential, but they are a little uncertain, a little worried.
My point is, so that project, that first stage of that project is 300 jobs in construction and 150 ongoing. That is not enough. 10 times that is not enough to sustain a town of 35,000 people. And I think they want those industries. They know that they're coming in a way that, I was up here in 2018. That was not, they did not want those, not they didn't want them, but they didn't believe that they were on the horizon in a meaningful way.
Do you think, in that
there's a shift and there's an openness to it, but they are naturally distrustful of the delivery because neither side has actually articulated what that job looks like in 2030, in 2035, as we divest from at least thermal coal, even if metallurgical continues to export.
What about that word transition, isn't it? Because we keep hearing the word transition, but here they want to make sure it's a slow transition. Up in Biloela, they want to make sure that the coal-fired power station is still operating in 2038. Now, down south...
You were up there yesterday, weren't you, in Biloela?
So down south, people might assume that it's going to be easy to phase out coal-fired power. Well, you tell that to the people of Biloela, they'll tell you they want a coal-fired power station running in 2038. A little bit before the show, an LNG tanker sailed by. That's tens of millions of dollars on every one of those tankers. And so this is the industry in this area, and they want a slow transition. If they're going to have a transition, and if there are going to be jobs in hydrogen, they want to see those projects before they suddenly declare that it's all going to be rosy and they'll back them in. But I think the other issue is there's a lot of wealth created here. Now, they have a good life in parts of this region. I mean, it's, the lovely parts of this region, right? But they see a lot of wealth being produced. There are questions about whether they're getting their fair share. Health is an issue that comes up. When I talk to people, I heard terrible stories about people who had to go to Brisbane for care that they could not get here.
And not
Others are happy with
care either. Sometimes pretty basic.
So that is, you can see issues working both ways. Working for the LNP, but if Labor has a strong message on healthcare, I think that can cut through as well.
I think that the danger for the coalition in a seat like this, especially with a retiring MP, is to have the 2019 campaign again. Because the thing I picked up from talking to people is that level of alarm that I do think happened when Adani was a central issue, when kind of the cavalcade and Bob Brown came down, that's actually shifted quite a lot. And to give credit to Anthony Albanese's side, they've really neutralised the issue quite successfully from my conversations with people. And so there is a vulnerability now for the coalition to talk about those jobs of the future, because that transition is key. People are not silly. They know where the world is going. They love the town. They don't want to leave the region, and they need answers about what that looks like. And that answer, I don't think, is adequately being provided. There is the dualling issue, though, around health, you're right, and Labor is making that the #1 campaigning point. and it's actually resonating and getting traction. And I got quite a few people telling me that they do feel like Scott Morrison has dropped the ball, quite sort of negative sentiments, which I was surprised by.
We'll hear some of the views of the locals here, the undecided voters in particular, about the two leaders, Scott Morrison, Anthony Albanese. But time to hear from the Deputy Prime Minister and Nationals leader Barnaby Joyce, who I spoke to this morning here in Gladstone at the Gladstone Yacht Club. Barnaby Joyce, welcome to the program.
Been nice and close. Yes, thank you.
Good to be in Gladstone. Look, let's start on the Solomon Islands before we get to what's happening more locally here. For years you've been warning about the need to take the threat of China more seriously. Yeah. Now there's the prospect of a Chinese military base, which you've called a little Cuba on our doorstep. Was this threat taken seriously enough?
Well, you're right, but right back to 2009 when I fought against the Chinalco, which is a state-owned enterprise trying to take over Rio. And I think I was belittled by all sides there, called a redneck, a xenophobe, a bigot. Now they just say it's correct. Yes, this has been a long-term plan. The Chinese government works to a long-term plan. And this is just another form of island hopping, which is part of the strategic process so often used by either the United States or Japan or now China to get a presence. Now, the Solomons has said that they will not be allowing a Chinese naval base.
Do you believe that?
Well, I believe that if they say it, that is their policy. I believe that that is not what the Chinese want, and I base it on what they're doing in Djibouti, in Tajikistan, in Myanmar. In Djibouti, they have up to, at times, 2,000 troops on the ground, 2,000 sailors, and obviously that would be a great problem for Australia.
Hence your little Cuba comment. Do you think it's really that serious?
I just hope that China does not get the capacity to set up a naval base, because it's obviously an intimidating tactic to Australia.
Do you think they will?
They'd want to. They want to. There's no doubt about that, because we see what they did in the South China Sea, where they said they weren't going to militarise. And obviously for the Solomons, I take their word, but I say be really careful inviting a totalitarian power into your country, because it is going to affect your sovereignty. And
so coming back to whether Australia took it seriously enough, the Prime Minister apparently only spoke to his counterpart in the Solomons once in the past month. The Foreign Minister wasn't sent there. The US, by contrast, have sent this top-level delegation, Kurt Campbell and so on. I mean, do you think Australia took a gently approach?
No, I don't. And I'm Deputy Chair of the National Security Committee. And I'd say that the Prime Minister has been in an intense process around this for a long period of time, not just with the Solomons, but also with the Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, as a mechanism of that is her portfolio. And also with a whole plethora of other Pacific nations. I mean, this is not something that we were blinded by, we didn't wish for, we were very concerned about, and that's why right now the United States and Australia, working in lockstep, the Solomons have offered the commitment, have said, not offered, have placed the commitment that there will not be a naval base in the Solomons.
But can you understand what people think, oh, hang on, why didn't you send the Foreign Minister? Why didn't the PM pick up the phone a few more times?
Well, the Prime Minister did pick up the phone, and the Prime Minister, in one of his first visits after becoming Prime Minister, went into the Pacific Islands.
But since we knew about this deal, it seems like there was only one phone call. Can you explain why?
I cannot confirm or how many phone calls were made. Obviously, as Deputy Chair of the National Security Committee, it comes with 15 years in jail if you start declaring what happens. But I think it's...
You can say how many phone calls he made.
No, I can't.
That's a national security secret, is it?
I think I think in some instances it is. Yeah.
How many times did you call a foreign leader?
If it's in regards to our defence, yeah, and if it's part and parcel of discussions on the National Security Committee, yes, absolutely.
Do you think
it has cabinet and competence and beyond cabinet and competence how you deal with those issues?
Do you think Prime Minister Sogavare was bribed by China?
Look, I have no evidence of that. So what I would say is for Mr. Sogavare himself to explain how this is. What I will say, and I'll repeat, if you invite a totalitarian regime into your country, of course it will have effect on your sovereignty. And that's something that is not fiction. You can go to other countries where the Chinese government are involved, and it most definitely affects the sovereignty. And Djibouti is one.
Yeah, the US says it'll respond accordingly if China does establish a military base there. What does that mean?
Well, it means that the United States also is very aware of tactics in the Pacific and how they work. With the United States, we've been involved in a world war in the Pacific.
So how will they respond?
Well, that's for the United States to discuss, but I would say that the United States is in lockstep with Australia.
So how would Australia respond?
This is very serious, and we're going to make sure that we keep our nation as strong as possible and get there as quickly as possible, which I've been saying for a long, long while.
So what would Australia do?
Well, that is a discussion that obviously I'm not going to start going through combinations and permutations of what happens in the future, because right now the most important thing is the Solomon's Mr. Socavare has said that they will not be entertaining a Chinese naval base. Now, that is their statement. That is their statement, and so we'll stick with their statement.
Is there anything the government would do if you're re-elected to stop China encroaching further in the Pacific? Anything you'd change?
Well, we're always incredibly aware of what this means, and the Australian people should be incredibly aware, because about 2,000 kilometres off there, that we know what the Chinese wishes are, and we don't want their wishes to happen. Because, and we've been aware of this, that's why we have AUKUS, that's why we're buying nuclear submarines, that's why we have the Quad, and I think you'll find that those preparations started also quite some time ago.
Let's turn to the issues here in Gladstone. I mean, China and national security has been on the minds of people I've been speaking to. They're also a little worried about the energy transition that's often talked about here. There is hope this region becomes a powerhouse for green energy and hydrogen. But some uncertainty, and they want to see a plan. What is your plan?
Well, they have uncertainty because of this. They have the possible Prime Minister of Australia, who right at the very start was unable to comprehend basic economic facts or was unaware of them. That concerns people here. Then you had, on a key policy, because we're in a regional area, they're super clinics where they were either they stumbled, they fumbled. I think they BS'd a bit.
You're talking about Labor's policies. My question is about your plan for this region.
I think it's also important because we're getting to that they're unable to cost out their super clinic policy.
Do you have a plan?
Then they
for
started.
This region?
Yeah, we do. I'm getting to it. And then they lied about our policy, which people knew were a lie, yet they still stare down the barrel and lie about it, which is saying that...
So what's your plan for the region?
Well, let's look at exactly here. Their key policy on their climate change policy...
Let's talk about your plan if we can.
Well, it's because it's different to theirs, is the safeguard mechanism, which both the potential acting Prime Minister and the potential Treasurer had no idea about.
Can we get to a plan?
And what we are doing is making sure that, because their plan is to break down, our plan is, as long as they want to buy coal, we are selling coal. Because we have to become as strong as possible, as quickly as possible.
As long as they want the energy transition. People I've spoken to are very keen to hear some sort of plan for this energy transition.
And here's the vital difference, is that we are standing by the jobs they've got and we are investing billions in towards hydrogen. But we are not going to be saying to people the word transition, because that equals unemployment. Transition to what? There is no other industry here. But we are investing billions of dollars for hydrogen.
And where's that going? What's that billions
what that allows them to do is them to see, workers in Gladstone to see, there is the other job at the same pay and same conditions. So now what the Labor Party is doing is saying...
Let's just stick with yours if we can. Sorry, we've heard a fair bit about Labor's. What are your billions for hydrogen doing?
Well, the billions we've seen in our regional plan, you're seeing with our expansion of the Pilbara and the investment in there, in Darwin with critical minerals, that are vital, with the investment here and the investment across our nation, working with other major such as Fortescue Metals towards hydrogen, but we are not going to take people out of their jobs.
So you're putting money into Fortescue's hydrogen plants?
The Labor Party are taking them out of their job as they reduce their safeguard mechenism.
Can we stick with your plan just for a moment? Are you putting some of that money?
If you just let me answer this question, then we can go to yours. If the Labor, and don't edit this out.
We've heard a lot about Labor.
If the Labor Party reduces, I'll answer the question for the possible acting Prime Minister and future Treasurer. If you bring in a reduction in your safeguard mechanism, yes, you do have to buy permits. It's in the policy.
Okay.
You should have read it.
We've got the point. Are you putting money into Fortescue's hydrogen plans?
We're going to work for, especially for the setup of the fundamental infrastructure to support that.
What does that mean?
That means whether it's roads, whether it's headworks, whether it's the capacity to allow these investments to come forward.
But you wouldn't underwrite a hydrogen plant?
Well, I'm not at this stage. No, I don't think that's
You've long advocated the need to underwrite new coal-fired power.
Well,
why not hydrogen?
I don't think that's correct.
You moved an amendment under your name about a year ago in Parliament.
I think what the issue which we need there is if people are looking for support through the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund or the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to make coal cleaner, to make coal more energy efficient, that is certainly something we'd be considered. But just
what about
to say
the Collinsville?
Blankly,
what about the Collinsville coal-fired power plant?
Well,
do you still want to build that?
The business case is going forward, and if the business case stacks up, and I'm quite happy for us to build it. But it's not that not that we build it. I think there should be access. If a business case stacks up, then people should be able to access the finance, and certain things such as Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund should certainly give it a consideration.
Why do we still need to wait for the business case for you to make a call on that? A few weeks ago, you told me on Q&A you didn't need a business case to commit to the Hells Gate Dam.
Well, the Hells Gate Dam is quite self-evident. It's been brought forward by the Townsville Enterprise Corporation. And I'll tell you what the difference is. It's a good question, right? That's why you got the job. Because it's actually Labor Party policy, Hells Gate Dam. It's actually, they took it to a state election. And then they said, to try and say, we're not run by the Greens, we'd build it. Well, we've actually given them all the money.
So because Labor like it?
I guess they won't. Well, I suppose unless we believe the Queensland Labor government is also incompetent and unable to. I mean, watching their interviews is like, it's just train wreck interviews.
We're back onto Labor. Just a couple of other local issues. Health comes up a lot here.
Yep.
The lack of GPs in regional areas like this. What more can you do to get more doctors into the regions?
Well, I think that the first thing is, that's in regional. We actually have a regional health minister. The Labor Party have a minister for the Republic. Now, I don't know how that works. You have an accident, and you find out whether we believe in a photo of the Queen.
How are you going to get more GPs here?
Well, David Gillespie, the regional health minister, which we have and they don't, will be bringing forward a policy in the coming week to deal with this issue. What will that involve? Well, I'm not going to announce David Gillespie's policy for him. So, and we've brought forward the Murray-Darling Basin Medical School in the past. We'll be expanding allied health services, and you'll hear that in very short form in other areas to make sure it comes forward. We have regional medical schools. My daughter goes to one in Newcastle, training as a doctor. So, we have been alive to this issue. In fact, it's the Nationals and Liberals which have been driving this issue, and we have much further to add in this space. The Labor Party can't even cost their own super clinic policy, and they don't even have a regional health minister, but they do have a minister for the Republic.
And Billawheeler's just down the road.
Yep, Billa.
Your position is very clear on the family of asylum seekers that 4 years ago were put in detention.
You're going to ask me what correspondence I have, and I'm not going to tell you.
No, I was going to ask you whether you still think they should be returned to Billawheeler.
I believe my position remains the same. I try to remain constant in this. The position I have in Billawheeler and Central Queensland is the same I have in Canberra. I think that's one of the problems with the Labor Party. They have different positions for different towns.
So have you had any luck convincing the immigration minister on that?
I'm having discussions with them, and we have seen that at this point in time, this family has not been extradited to back to Sri Lanka.
Could there be movement on that before the election?
I'm not going to sort of entertain the positions on this.
Look, final one. You've and your colleagues have been on quite a spending spree in the lead up to and during the campaign, billions for a lot of regional infrastructure. I mean, yesterday the PM was also announcing $20 million for fishing, boating, camping facilities, the sort of stuff local government typically does. This is despite the fact that we've got debt like we've never seen in Australia before, and now the PM today is guaranteeing no new taxes or increased taxes in the next term of Parliament. Won't something have to give after the election to deal with this debt?
We've had a turnaround of over $100 billion in our deficit position because we actually do respect the fact we're making so much money from the export of coal, selling more of it at a higher price than we've done before. We've got unemployment at 4% and we're bringing it lower, which saves so much off our budget. We are making sure that in our investments, that the National Party was crucial in the negotiations. We have further expansion of where we make money, whether that's the Pilbara, whether that's the Northern Territory, sealing a third road through the deserts with critical mineral precincts to drive that industry, critical critical minerals ahead, hydrogen, coal, being unafraid to say the word and to stand behind it.
What about debt? You don't talk about debt so much anymore.
And what we're doing, and in the debt, the way to understand that is not to listen to me or to listen to the Labor Party, but to listen to Fitch, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, which has us as AAA rated, which means we're there with Switzerland and Norway. We're above the United States, we're above England, we're above Japan, and that is a very good recommendation of our economic strength, which I truly believe if the Labor Party gets in, they will put it under threat, as they always do.
Barnaby Joyce, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
Barnaby Joyce talking to us just before we began the broadcast. David Crowe, he's still in favour of bringing the asylum seeker family back to Biloela. You were there yesterday.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting comment from Barnaby Joyce. And meanwhile, we've got Scott Morrison and the Immigration Minister, Alex Hawke, saying no. When I was in Biloela yesterday, you can tell that most of that community want the Murugappan family back. The two daughters were born in Australia, so they don't see a problem with having that family back and working in the community because they need workers, so they'd be perfectly welcome. And when I spoke to friends of the Murugappans, Bronwyn Dendell, Angela Fredericks, they're totally fed up with the argument that they hear from other ministers, but not from Barnaby Joyce, that it's before the courts and they can't do anything. The Immigration Minister's got the discretion, could do something.
All right, we'll come back to the panel in a sec. Time to check in, though, with Casey Briggs, who's been crunching the numbers each week to give us a better understanding of what's going on in the campaign. Casey, very good morning to you. You have been tracking the leaders around the country through the campaign, but one of them has stopped moving.
Hey, David, looks great in Queensland. But yes, there's a fair few pins on our leader tracker map this week because one of the leaders we're tracking is spending a whole lot of time in this seat here, the safe Labor seat of Grayndler. Beyond that, of course, though, where last week was, all about Tasmania, New South Wales and Melbourne, this week the focus has been much more on Queensland and southeast Queensland and the west. I want to show you, though, where the Prime Minister has been moving through this campaign and actually take it right back to the beginning of the campaign because the PM spent a fair bit of time in Sydney, particularly in Western Sydney, and interestingly he spent no time at all in this band of city seats along the east. That's Wentworth, Warringah, North Sydney and Mackellar. The PM's also been to Melbourne. He's visited the marginal seats of Chisholm and Higgins. Where hasn't he been? Well, he hasn't been to Kooyong and he hasn't been to Goldstein. What do those seats all have in common? Those six are all obviously seats being challenged by high-profile so-called teal independents. And the PM's been absent. Interestingly, the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, has been travelling through some of those seats this week, taking him away from his own battle in the seat of Kooyong. I want to take you to some of the spending data that we're seeing on Facebook in these seats, because I think it gives us some clues as to what the Liberal Party strategy and maybe priorities are here. And I just want to say we can't make any definitive statements about how much money is going into each of these seats specifically on Facebook, because obviously there's a multitude of accounts attached to the major parties. Those moderate Liberals are all benefiting from these sorts of ads from Liberal HQ. But I think looking up and tallying the candidate spends on the candidates' own pages in these seats gives us a bit of a flavour for the ground game. And let me show you this chart here, which tallies up those candidates in those seats. These are the top 5 in the nation over the last 90 days. And you'll see something that brings them all in common. And Kooyong is the absolute outlier here, with the most money going into it on candidate pages in the country at the moment. If we have a look at how Kooyong's spend has changed through time, it's really interesting to see on a week-by-week basis. Josh Frydenberg had a spike in spending in mid-March, dropped off again, but has spiked again in the early days and in the lead-up to this campaign. And really, he has been outspending his challenger, Dr. Monique Ryan, since about early March. So that's interesting for one thing to see. But if we have a look back at those other seats, you'll see it's Wentworth, North Sydney, Mackellar, Hume, all of those, the pattern's reversed. The independents outspending the Liberal incumbent. In Wentworth's case, by Allegra Spender by some margin. Let's actually just have a quick look at the seat of Wentworth. This is where it is here in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and these were the results from last time. If Allegra Spender, the independent, can maintain the level of support that Kerryn Phelps got 3 years ago, so about 32%, and that's not a certainty, but if she can do that, then Dave Sharma's really only a couple of percentage points away from losing his job. He is in a really tough fight here, which kind of means looking at his spending data on Facebook, it tells us a slightly curious story. Dave Sharma had a spending surge just before, in the lead up to this campaign, in the first few days of the campaign proper. Curiously, that has dropped way back down again since really the first week of this campaign, and Allegra Spender is back to spending more money than Dave Sharma on Facebook on their accounts in that seat. Obviously, campaigns have priorities. The Liberal Party has finite resources here. It looks like, on Facebook at least, they're choosing to put more of their money into the federal treasurer's seat of Kooyong. Obviously, if he loses his seat, that would be a big loss for the party. So I guess the question is, are they supremely confident of winning seats like this, or are they really putting resources to save Josh Frydenberg at the expense of candidates like Dave Sharma, like Trent Zimmerman, even Jason Falinski, David?
That is fascinating to look at. Casey Briggs, thanks very much for that. Let's come back to the panel. And there's a fascinating battle going on in all of those teal seats, as they're called, the progressive Liberal seats. Don't know if we'll see much of the Prime Minister in any of them over the next few weeks, but a lot of Josh Frydenberg. Let's come to the perceptions of the two leaders. You can watch more of the people that I've been speaking to on iView, more of their views on Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese. I can tell you the sort of things that I've picked up. I wouldn't say a lot of anger towards either of them, and a lot of the scare campaigns we're hearing from the leaders don't seem to be on the minds of people I've been talking to. What have you picked up about Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese here, Claire?
I think they're still looking for information on who Anthony Albanese is and what his government would look like. That was always going to be an issue with Labor, leaving it so late in the campaign to really start to colour in the picture. They haven't announced a lot of policies. That's not necessarily a bad thing. They want to have this fight on sort of principled values, vibes, if you will. Yeah. But you need that detail. People are looking for it. I think they're very ready to move on from Scott Morrison. They don't like the way that he handled a lot of the natural disasters, the response to the pandemic, but they are searching for some certainty around where they then park their vote.
PK, one interesting thing I found was the women I spoke to here, a lot of them were pretty unhappy with Scott Morrison. The blokes, I got a lot more than I have elsewhere in the country. Gee, it's been a tough few years. He's done okay given all the difficulties.
That's exactly what I got.
Did you?
Yeah, and we haven't
I didn't mention that to you. That's
I noticed that overwhelmingly, and not just here, but in other places I've been to, and it feels extremely gendered. In fact, the data demonstrates that as well. Some of the public polling shows there is a really big gender split. And in fact, I spoke to some Liberal people yesterday who said to me that this issue, this gender issue, is playing out very strongly and is actually hurting them among women. And I think this is, if we go back to the Teal candidates, these professional women, they are very appealing against what is being framed as a sort of stale, out-of-touch Morrison.
Well, it's a very blokey campaign. I mean, what was yesterday? Fishing, boating campaign?
It's an incredibly blokey campaign, and we've seen the Prime Minister have his, wife come along to things.
Well, she was there yesterday.
Yeah, that's right. So, yes. But I don't think that kind of neutralises just the level of blokiness and the alienation of women.
Because women handed him the result last time. That swung him behind him. So he's lost the thing that won him the election last time.
It sets up an opportunity for Anthony Albanese, and I'm not sure whether they've executed on that opportunity yet. I remember one lady at the shops in Gladstone on Friday was sacked both of them. Anthony Albanese, Scott Morrison, sacked both of them. So there's a level of discontent there, and how Labor then taps into that is still yet to be seen. So disenchantment is there. But I have picked up in other seats, in Gilmore actually, when I was there quite a while ago, that sense that some people feel sorry for Scott Morrison. Don't underestimate the people who think that he's had a hard
That's
time.
exactly it, and it's really resonated here amongst the people I've spoken to. A lot more sympathy for how he's gone over the last few years and elsewhere. Anyway, our panel, Claire Armstrong, David Crowe, Patricia Gabelis, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mark Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with the one and only Jack the Insider, who's a columnist for The Australian.
G'day, Mike.
How are you, mate?
Blessed to be here.
The campaigns did hit troubled waters this week as China signed a security pact with a Pacific neighbour, and this beautiful Mark Knight. Do you find any problem with the fact China wants to rename this New Zealand?
New Zealand.
New Zealand.
New Zealand. Oh,
New Zealand.
Yeah, no, that actually might kick off.
John Shakespeare, take me to the April sun in Cuba.
Via April storm in the Solomons.
Yeah,
yes.
Bit of a shitstorm, really.
Yes, it is a little bit of a shitstorm. Chinese troops will be there very, very soon.
David Pope has also taken up on the April sun. Take me to the April sun in Horiara.
Whoa.
Can any power guarantee security in the Pacific while it continues to fuel the climate emergency? We've got Team Z. Not the A team, the Z team.
Yes, what did Elbow call the junior burger?
The junior burger.
I just need to finish posting these extreme green election memes.
Yeah.
You know.
This is a beautiful David Rowe.
So much going on.
There's so much going on. We've got Peter Dutton in his Spuddos.
Yes, in the Spuddos,
who's lying in the sun getting green.
She's turning slightly blue.
And Maurice is coming out of Barangaroo here, I think, her fundraising campaign. What did I miss?
Yeah, they've missed a little bit there. There is the periscope.
The periscope's here.
Having a bit of a look.
Well, it can't be ours.
And of course, Scotty's got the shark shorts on and the socks.
The battle for the hearts and minds started with the first debate in Brisbane on Sky. Might have been a super spreader event.
Well, it's actually taken Elbow out. Will this be the tonic that Labor needed in the campaign, having Elbow locked up for 7 days?
I think the tonic for the electorate would be if we locked them both up for 7 days, wouldn't it?
Maybe that would work.
Debate prep. And the price of bread is $3.
Well, price, yeah. Oh, that was yesterday. Inflation just made it $3.50 today. Yes, because, you know, the inevitable question, that's how you research for debates now. What's the price of bread? What's the price of milk? What's the price of a tank of juice?
Google it, mate.
Yeah.
Polly Farmer's got his own goggle box here, reality TV. What's on?
Well, let's see. We've got Lego Masters, The Voice, or MasterChef.
Isn't there something that isn't a reality show?
Hang on.
Click.
Welcome to the first debate between ScoMo and Elbow. There you go.
Well,
reality.
Yeah.
Wow, kind of.
Mark Knight, who's getting to grips with the skinny Elbow.
Yes, you can tell it's a challenge,
right?
Mark, yeah.
Elbow, you know how after the win in the debate you said you were really feeling positive?
Positive? Here we go. You are positive.
You are positive. They say that a week is a long time in politics, but campaigns have a timeline all their own, and the pictures coming out of both campaigns, we'll just have a bit of a look at.
That's a fantastic photo, isn't it? It looks like something's actually growing out of Elbow's head.
Yes.
Alien style, and he's watching us very, very closely.
Anthony Albanese visited the Byron Bay Blues Fest. Boogate.
Yeah, well, as I understand it, it was a bit of applause early on when he first arrived, and then when he made his way to the stage.
Well, he was introduced, I'm told, by people there as the working class man, so people were expecting...
Oh, Barnesy.
Barnesy, right?
Come on.
Now, if you're expecting Barnesy and Elbow comes out,
that's right.
And there was a bit of booing then, but it very rapidly changed to applause.
It doesn't matter that he was wearing jeans. It's just not Barnesy, and that's going to be disappointing for a lot of people.
Bit of planking.
Yes, there's planking. That was a hit in 2016. The 2016 election, a lot of planking going on, and he's revisited it there.
James Brickwood, very good, and exhaling a cloud of gaseous substance.
Mist, yes, some sort of mist. Michaela is probably the most expressive person in Australia, I think. She could, if you play poker against her, you'd take her to the cleaners, wouldn't you?
Look, it's been a great pleasure unpicking the events of this week. Good luck for the rest of the campaign.
It's been fantastic. Great to be here. Thank you very much. And it's back to you, Spearsy.
All the way up in Gladstone.
Wow.
Indeed we are. Jack, Mike, thank you both very much for that. Let's get some final observations. Claire, to you first.
96.8% of eligible Australians are enrolled. The AEC is calling it a modern democratic miracle. What's driving this? Young people. If you combine that with the jump in enrolments ahead of the marriage equality plebiscite, we have a highly enfranchised 18 to 29-year-old cohort. And not only that, they are living in electorates that for their entire parents' lives were safe as houses, and now they're not. They're armed, ready to vote, and I think they're really going to use it.
Great point. Go generation, what is it, Z?
My generation? Yeah.
Whatever generation it is. David.
Need a new alphabet.
Thank you to the Insiders crew for getting us out of the Melbourne studio and up to Gladstone. It's been fascinating talking to the locals. Helga Smythe was one of the people that I spoke to, and she really brought home to me the problems for regional Australians with health systems, not just in this electorate. When Helga had a cancer diagnosis, she could get some of the treatment from Gladstone Hospital. She lives in Gladstone, but she couldn't get all of it. And so she ended up having to fly to Brisbane for some of that treatment, which is a terrible thing to have to go through. I've talked to people in northern Brisbane in the past, in Longman, in Caboolture, who've had to get on maxi taxis for that. But to have to fly to Brisbane highlights the pressure on regional health systems. And a shout out to Steve Bates in Biloela. Great barber, and he's a sign of disenchantment. The sign of disenchantment with the two major parties. He's not voting for one of the majors, probably leaning to UAP.
All right, PJ.
Okay, I just think you need to look at Sydney in terms of the election battle. It's been described to me as a tale of two cities. Scott Morrison playing well in Western Sydney and being on the hunt there, but actually really struggling in not only the Teal seats, but also the seat of Bennelong. I also want to say happy Orthodox Easter, particularly to the Ukrainian community today.
Very good. Here. Look, thank you all for being here in Gladstone, spending the time that you have. Big thanks to the Insiders crew that have made this happen. A big thanks to everyone in Gladstone who's made this show and Q&A the other night happen as well. You've been very welcoming and very supportive, so really appreciate that. Also, for viewers in Queensland this morning, do want to apologise for the technical problem at the start. You missed a bit of the start of the show. Good thing is you can watch the whole lot on iView, so get on iView if you want to catch up with any of